Chapter 2765. Luo Fan could see the various changes happening in the world of laws. Naturally, these world founders could also see it with the help of their incarnations. Although they were not like Luo Fan, who had a deep understanding of the world, the state of the primal chaos, and the great tribulation of the world, and could extract the most crucial nutrients from them, they were still the founders of the world. After all, they were existences with their own unique worldviews. Seeing the new development of the worldview unfolding in front of them, and seeing the changes that could greatly expand their worldview unfold in front of them, how could they not comprehend anything? At this moment, although none of the world founders really expanded their worldview, every one of them vaguely felt that they seemed to have found some kind of subtle path. It was as if they could vaguely see a new direction of development appearing in the endless fog in front of them. It was a feeling that was extremely important to the creators of the world. After all, the creators of this world had already reached the limit that they could ascend to. At this moment, the path of cultivation that appeared in front of them was completely shrouded in fog. All they could do now was to work hard to nurture and strengthen their world, and use the improvement and strengthening of the world to help them in turn. They obviously didn't know anything about the true cultivation of their body and mind. But now, in the boundless fog of cultivation, there was a blurry path that led to an unknown place. What was the difference between this and giving them a rope in a desperate situation? In an instant, they threw everything else to the back of their minds and began to wholeheartedly explore this path. As for the clones that entered the world of laws, they didn't care about them at all. It was just a clone, and it was worth it to treat it as a tuition fee. Of course, the world founders who could truly comprehend a new path of advancement from the world of laws were only a minority among the many world founders. After all, the vast majority of world founders had long abandoned their clones in the world of laws. For people like them, they didn't understand anything that was happening in the world of laws at all. Perhaps they might be able to comprehend some subtle experiences after witnessing the changes in the world of laws, and they might be able to have a slight impact on their own cultivation. However, if they wanted to go a step further and link everything that was happening within the world of laws to abstract their own cultivation path and direction, it was obviously too much. However, even if not all of them had such great gains, as long as there were gains, it was enough to calm down the entire transportation network layer. When one was stuck in a certain realm for hundreds of millions of years without being able to make any progress, one would realize the significance of a little bit of hope. For the many founders of the world in the transportation network layer, the various changes in the world represented the hope of improvement. Under such circumstances, even if they had to pay a heavy price, they were willing to accelerate the evolution of this world. Naturally, they wouldn't be disturbed anymore. At this moment, perhaps it was because of the changes in the world, or perhaps it was because the time was up, or perhaps it was because the opportunity had arrived. In short, the tribulation layer had unknowingly begun to extend its tentacles towards the various worlds in the transportation network layer. Of course, although the tribulation layer had taken action, it would still take a long time for their tribulations to erupt. At the very least, it would be a very long time for the worlds themselves. These tribulation channels might be constantly injecting the power of the tribulations into those worlds, but this was only a brewing tribulation, and it wasn't about to erupt immediately. It was just like the changes that Luo Fan encountered before the second great tribulation of the world. For those worlds, this was both a danger and an opportunity. The danger was that if one didn't discover the existence of the power of the tribulations and thought that one's world was already without tribulations, then the power of the tribulations would be like a hand that was constantly tightening around one's throat, and one's throat might be snapped at any time. On the other hand, opportunities were the opposite. If one could clearly grasp the power of this tribulation and deal with it before it was brewed, then just like Luo Fan, he wouldn't even need to truly experience the second great tribulation of the world to be able to completely eliminate the second great tribulation of the world. In that case, there would be no need to use the rewards of the tribulation layer on repairing the world at all. Instead, all the rewards could be used to develop and improve the world. The benefits to the world and to the creator of the world were self-evident. However, it was obvious that not all creators were like Luo Fan. In the transportation network layer, there was only one creator who could truly discover the tentacles of the tribulation layer and the power of the tribulations, and that was Luo Fan. The other cultivators were obviously blindly optimistic at this moment, and had no idea that a rope had already been tied around their necks. To them, the most important thing at this moment was obviously the changes in the transportation network layer and the changes in the world. What he wanted was to comprehend some of the principles and mysteries that would be beneficial to his own cultivation from these changes. Everything else was secondary to them. Of course, the worlds that really encountered the tentacles of the tribulation layer were not all in the transportation network layer. Apart from a small number of worlds that were unaffected by the power of the tribulation layer, due to certain factors, they were still relaxed. Most of the worlds that could stay out of the tribulation layer were those that had already been enveloped by the power of the tribulation layer. Such worlds were already in the midst of the first Great Tribulation, and the power of the tribulation that represented the precursor of the second Great Tribulation obviously couldn't enter these worlds. The reason why these worlds could stay out of the tribulation layer was actually very simple. It was because these worlds had already been taken over by the incarnation of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. It was the incarnation of the heavenly Tao that was helping them deal with the tribulation. Under such circumstances, although those worlds weren't completely silent and not as if they were not in the tribulation layer, there wouldn't be too much of a commotion. At the very least, there wouldn't be any commotion that would cause chaos in the world. Such a situation was obviously much better than the situation of the other worlds that had a rope around their necks. It wouldn't be a problem to say that they could stay out of the tribulation layer. Making up for the blanks in one's worldview according to the situation of the world seemed very simple. But in fact, it was extremely difficult. Even with Luo Fan's understanding of the world and his understanding of the world, he couldn't complete this task in a short period of time. This was especially so when the world of laws was extending at an extremely fast speed, pulling the parallel world into the main world. During this period of time, the situation of the world of laws was still changing at every moment. The conclusion drawn at this time might be completely overturned in the next moment when the world changed. Under such circumstances, it went without saying how difficult it was to sort out a feasible explanation that could completely make up for the blanks in the world of laws. It could be said that although this complicated process didn't exhaust Luo Fan mentally and physically, it was still complicated and difficult to solve. The worldview of laws wanted to connect the many parallel worlds and establish a mutual influence mechanism for these parallel worlds. Obviously, it was impossible to just copy the situation in the world of laws. Even if it was just for temporary use, it couldn't be so crude. Not to mention anything else. Although there were countless incarnations of the world's creators in the many parallel worlds in the world of laws at this time, there were even tens of millions of them. How could the number of these incarnations be compared to the number of parallel worlds? One had to know that the number of parallel worlds in a world was in the hundreds of trillions. Moreover, it was increasing all the time. Under such circumstances, what were tens of millions of incarnations of the world's creators? Even saying that it was a drop in the bucket would be an understatement. With such a background, it was obviously a fantasy to copy the incarnations of the world's creators and directly establish a theoretical system that completely connected all parallel worlds. What Luo Fan could do now was obviously to abstract a feasible mechanism that was closest to the real world according to the specific changes in the world, the commonality behind these parallel networks that had been established, and the fundamental principle behind them. Just this description alone was enough to show how troublesome this task was. At this time, Luo Fan was no longer in the mood to pay attention to the various situations in the transportation network layer. As for the shackles that were constantly changing in the unseen world, he didn't care about them at all. It wasn't because he couldn't grasp the changes of the shackles, but because he had already understood that before his world of laws stabilized, the shackles would never truly stabilize. In fact, he had already roughly guessed what the shackles were trying to do with their constantly changing state. The shackles were actually looking for a code, or rather, they were trying their best to find a transit world between Luo Fan and that world. Don't forget that the shackles were now from the world that had passed through the fourth Great Tribulation. Although Luo Fan had now ushered in the third Great Tribulation, no matter what, according to the situation of the world, he could only be considered to have passed through the second Great Tribulation at most. Under such circumstances, according to the pyramid structure that simulated the state of chaos, between the world that had passed through the fourth Great Tribulation and Luo Fan's world of laws, there should obviously be a world that had passed through the third Great Tribulation as a transit world. However, it was obvious that Luo Fan had used his incarnation to cause a huge commotion and destroyed the world that was directly connected to the world of laws. In this way, the connection between the shackles and Luo Fan's world of laws had obviously become unstable. There was only one way to truly stabilize it, and that was to find another world that could be used as a transit world to fill in this gap. Although Luo Fan didn't know the specific criteria for this search and how it would eventually appear, he definitely had to wait for the world of laws to truly change before it could be done. After all, according to the structure mechanism that simulated the state of chaos, the world that came to fill in the gap had to be related to Luo Fan's world of laws to a certain extent, and it also had to be related to the world that had passed through the fourth Great Tribulation. Naturally, it was a simple matter to find a world that was related to the world that had passed through the fourth Great Tribulation. Given the radiation range of the world that had passed through the fourth Great Tribulation, there would be as many such worlds as one wanted. However, if one wanted to find a world that was related to Luo Fan's world of laws, it would obviously require a lot of consideration. And the premise of all this consideration was obviously to see what the world of laws would look like after it stabilized in this way. It was obvious that this search would not end before the world of laws completely stabilized. This situation also gave Luo Fan a new revelation and allowed him to see a new possibility. Perhaps he actually didn't need to cut off this strange shackle layer by layer. Perhaps he only needed to destroy the correlation between his world of laws and other worlds as much as possible to achieve the goal of preventing the shackle from forming. Luo Fan naturally didn't know how many worlds there were in this simulated state of chaos. However, just by looking at the number of stars that he could see in the sky at this moment, he could guess that this number would definitely need to be described in trillions of trillions of trillions of stars to be able to clearly describe it. It went without saying how difficult it was to completely separate one's world of laws from so many worlds and make it have no commonality with so many worlds. Even someone as confident as Luo Fan didn't have the slightest confidence. Chapter 2766. The world had always been perfecting itself, and Luo Fan's worldview was naturally being perfected and changing. His worldview was constantly changing. In that case, it was obviously an impossible task for the world that had gone through the fifth tribulation to find a world that could influence and shackle the world of laws. As mentioned before, when the world was in a state of change, that kind of search would never yield results. And if the world that had gone through the fifth tribulation couldn't find such a transit world, of course, it would no longer be able to influence the world of laws. Naturally, from a certain point of view, the world of laws could be considered to have gained independence and was no longer connected to the structure of the pyramid. After understanding this, Luo Fan secretly heaved a sigh of relief and felt that his future had become extremely bright. The growth of the worldview had to be transformed into the growth of strength and the growth of cultivation realm. This obviously still needed a process. At least, it was impossible for the cultivation realm to immediately rise to a whole new level with the change of the worldview. In the middle, there was definitely a process of digestion, a process of connecting the worldview and cultivation realm. In particular, at this time, the ideas obtained by Luo Fan's worldview were just temporary ideas, but a temporary excess. This was even more so. After all, he needed to distinguish which of them were eternal and which needed to be replaced after a period of time. In other words, if he really completely integrated them with the worldview, they would contaminate himself. Because of this process, Luo Fan's cultivation realm had not improved much. If he wanted to directly see through everything with his increased cultivation level, break through everything, and finally completely eliminate this entire simulated state of chaos, for now, it was clearly impossible. At that moment, after discovering that he had temporarily broken away from the structure of the pyramid, Luo Fan began to focus his attention on his world of laws again, trying hard to sense any subtle changes in the world of laws. Through this sense, he carefully comprehended his worldview, experienced how the worldview was connected to the real world, and experienced how the new details in the worldview were transformed into real power. These were not simple, and it was the same for Luo Fan. As he sensed in this way, time gradually passed, and the changes in the world continued. The various rewards from the tribulation level couldn't appear endlessly. This was the case even if the world of laws seemed to be changing endlessly. In just a few years, the rewards that continuously appeared from the tribulation level and poured into the world of laws finally began to gradually disappear. By the time all the rewards disappeared, the world of laws had become several times stronger than before. Now, this world had completely surpassed the world that possessed the world of stars, and it had far surpassed it. And at this time, in the eyes of the many world founders in the transportation network level, the changes in the world of laws still hadn't stopped. Endless figures of the world of laws continued to walk out of the illusory world and piled up around the world of laws, becoming a part of the world they saw. They continuously strengthened the world of laws and also constantly increased the proportion of the world of laws in the transportation network level. Looks like it might continue endlessly. One of the founders of the world murmured with a thoughtful and shocked expression on his face. Although what exactly did this endless change represent, and what the specific reason was, the fact that a world could undergo such endless changes on a macro level had completely subverted the concept of almost all the world founders. The changes that appeared in the world of laws at this time made them feel a little at a loss. Even if this happened to Luo Fan, it would still be the same if it happened in the world of laws. At that moment, it was not just the creator of the world who felt complicated. Anyone who could see this scene and divine what this endless world was felt the same shock in their hearts. The gap between us and him is greater than we imagined. At this time, a world founder finally emphasized this understanding that had existed in their hearts for countless years. Faced with such an emphasis, the world creators who heard this all smiled bitterly. Some of the world founders focused their attention on the mist at the side of the world of laws. Compared to before, that mist had shrunk by God knows how many tens of thousands of times. The degree of shrinking felt as if the distance between the mist and the traffic network layer had been pulled by God knows how many tens of thousands of times. If it weren't for the fact that none of the pioneers of this world were ordinary and could easily discover even the tiniest of physical objects, they might not have been able to see where the mist was at all. The feeling that the core of the traffic network layer was no longer the world of laws had shrunk by God knows how many times. This feeling was so wonderful that it made them wonder if they were hallucinating. Looks like his victory this time is more significant than the last time. Some world founders who were certain that there was a higher level battle couldn't help but sigh. Amidst these emotions, some of the pioneers of the world gave birth to an even stronger fighting spirit. They wanted to fight against that world, and they wanted to fight against Luo Fan even more strongly. However, some world founders felt an irresistible sense of defeat in their hearts and felt that they had fallen into despair. These two different emotions, based on the same fact, represented the different temperaments of the world founders and their different understandings of the same fact. For the world founders that had a strong fighting spirit, Luo Fan's victory had greatly inspired them and made them understand that even the weak could win. Under such circumstances, they naturally had a lot of fighting spirit to resist Luo Fan. After all, the fighting spirit that was inspired wouldn't change because of the target. Even if the target was someone that had inspired their fighting spirit, it still wouldn't change. However, for the despairing world founders, all they saw was Luo Fan's strength. Because of Luo Fan's strength, they felt powerless in the process, which gave rise to an indescribable sense of despair. These two different natures clearly separated the creators of the world, causing the distance between them to grow further apart in the transportation network layer. However, for the world founders, separation was what they all wanted. The world founders who had the will to fight were happy to see them distancing themselves from despair. After all, the world founders who were in despair were malignant tumors to them, tumors that could affect their fighting spirit and erode their confidence. For the world founders that were in despair, it was also a good thing to distance themselves from the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit. In their eyes, the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit were the source of danger that could bring them and cause them to encounter Luo Fan's attacks. In this way, the transportation network layer had unknowingly been divided into three camps. Those who were still in a state of confusion and did not realize the changes in Luo Fan's world of laws, nor did they realize what the changes caused by the shift in the core of the transportation network layer represented. For the world founders, everything in the transportation network layer couldn't be more normal. The changes in Luo Fan's world of laws at most represented that he had survived a great calamity of the world. For these pioneers of the world, the transportation network layer was no different from before. Naturally, their positions would not change. The other camp was the world founders that were filled with fighting spirit. The world's founders, who were filled with fighting spirit, had a stronger will to resist Luo Fan. This resistance made their world involuntarily reject Luo Fan's world of laws. On the other hand, the remaining camp was made up of the despairing creators. They no longer had the will to resist Luo Fan's world of laws, and they had already submitted to him. In this way, the distribution of the three camps could be imagined. The world founders that were filled with fighting spirit and were more confident in resisting Luo Fan naturally left the world of laws and appeared in the outermost circle of the transportation network layer. On the other hand, the world creators who were at a loss and did not know what was happening or what the changes in the world represented remained where they were. In other words, they remained one level deeper into the world than the world creators who had the intention to resist. After that, it was the world founders that were already in despair. In this way, there were three layers from the inside to the outside: inner, middle, and outer, a total of three camps. This distribution wasn't the will of the world founders, but it was completely determined by their subconscious and their attitude towards the world of laws. Of course, although the mentalities of the many founders of the world had changed, none of them could recognize the essence of the structure of the world in the simulated chaotic state like Luo Fan. Therefore, they naturally couldn't recognize the shackles that had been extended from Luo Fan's world of laws that had been placed on them at this time. Moreover, because Luo Fan's world of laws had already passed the third world calamity, there were countless worlds outside the transportation network layer waiting to connect to the shackles of the world of laws. In fact, there were already many heavens and earths that had voluntarily connected to the chains. However, because this shackle was extremely subtle, it was a deeper and more obscure connection than resonance. Therefore, even though this shackle had been established, it was still not enough. Therefore, although the shackles had already been established, they still hadn't been connected to the transportation network layer and hadn't been seen by the many world founders here. Of course, for Luo Fan, if he wanted to achieve this goal, he only needed a heavenly Tao incarnation or even a thought. After all, the existence of the shackles itself represented the influence of the world of laws on the world itself. This influence was meaningless to the worlds that weren't aware of the existence of the shackles. However, for Luo Fan, who was already aware of the existence of the shackles, there were many uses for the shackles. He only needed a thought to easily change the way the shackles worked and change the world that was shackled by the shackles. The change didn't need to be too big or too obvious. He only needed to change the resonance characteristics of the world a little and connect it with the transportation network layer. At that time, the world would naturally connect to the transportation network layer and appear in the blank space of the transportation network layer that hadn't appeared yet. Of course, the current Luo fan didn't have the time to care about this. He hated the shackles that other worlds attached to his world of laws, and he even hated them to the extreme. However, this didn't mean that he would reject his own world and impose shackles on other worlds, reject his own world's influence on other worlds, and reject his control over other worlds. As for that, he couldn't do that. What was the difference between him and others? He obviously didn't have such a pretentious setting. Survival was cruel in itself. If you weren't willing to bear it, you would have to impose it on others in order to survive. At this time, for Luo Fan, the shackles that other worlds imposed on his world of laws were restrictions and shackles that he deeply detested. They were obstacles to his improvement, his survival, and his advancement. However, the shackles that he imposed on other worlds and his influence on other worlds were a means to help him obtain strength. Chapter 2767. If others knew about this difference in treatment, they would definitely feel that Luo Fan had double standards. He had one standard for others and another for himself. However, this was the truth. This was how survival was, and this was how cultivation was. Don't do to others what you don't want others to do to you. This was the moral standard. Do to others what you don't want others to do to you. This was the standard of survival and cultivation. Luo Fan had a deep understanding of this. Naturally, he wouldn't feel guilty or ashamed because of the different standards he had for himself and others. At this moment, he didn't have any grudges in his heart, and his body and mind were still extremely calm. Since his body and mind were calm, the different standards naturally wouldn't affect him. However, at this moment, Luo Fan clearly didn't have the energy to deal with the worlds that were waiting to be connected to the transportation network layer. At this moment, he put all his effort into transforming the worldview of laws into the improvement of his cultivation. At this moment, this had already consumed all of his energy. Apart from that, everything else was secondary to him. Even the benefits brought to him by connecting to the transportation network layer were negligible at this moment. Transforming the worldview of laws into the improvement of his cultivation was not a simple matter, nor was it a task that could be completed with a pat on the head. At this moment, he integrated his body and mind into his worldview of laws and the world of laws at the same time. He carefully experienced the difference between the two and the way they interacted with each other. During this process, the entire world of laws underwent all kinds of indescribable changes at the same time. Wind and clouds surged, lightning flashed, and thunder rumbled. These were just the most ordinary and basic changes. On a deeper level, laws were twisted and converted, time and space were split and deformed, and so on. These were just intermediate changes. More importantly, the reversal of fate and cause and effect were the truly huge changes. Amidst these changes, all kinds of indescribable mysteries constantly surged out from the depths of the world of laws and gradually appeared in the world. They were seen by all living beings in the world, and they were also sensed by the will of the world's founders, who had already integrated into the many parallel worlds. Sensing this, the wills fell into an indescribable silence. It wasn't that they had nothing to say, but that they didn't have the mood to talk anymore. Because the principles and profundities revealed by these various changes had completely drawn their attention, and it caused them to be utterly unable to divert their attention to think about anything else, as they were deeply afraid of missing the numerous profundities revealed before them. Under such circumstances, the law of heaven and earth seemed even calmer at this level. It was as if the whole world had become incomparably harmonious. Time slowly passed in this extremely harmonious atmosphere. Whether it was the flow of time in the world of laws or the flow of time in the transportation network layer, it was the same. Unknowingly, more than 100,000 years had passed. Moreover, this was only the flow of time in the transportation network layer. In the world of laws, the flow of time was more than 100 times longer. In other words, tens of millions of years during this period of time whether it was the law realm or the transportation network layer, the changes were almost earth-shattering. Needless to say, this period of time in the world of laws was a rare opportunity for development after the world of laws had completely survived the third great tribulation of the world. Such an opportunity for development was so rare that over tens of millions of years, it was enough to cause earth-shattering changes in many parallel worlds and the main body of the world. Whether it was the level of the cultivation world or other aspects, it was already worlds apart from tens of millions of years ago. The existence of many parallel worlds had already unknowingly become common knowledge, and countless methods and techniques had been developed specifically to deal with the existence of many parallel worlds. The most exaggerated thing was that the occupations of the parallel worlds had begun to appear in the world of laws. Any one of these changes was enough to overturn the worldview of other world founders, making them suspect that it wasn't tens of millions of years that had passed, but trillions of years instead. In contrast, the changes in the transportation network layer were much smaller than the changes in the world of laws, but it was still extremely shocking. At the very least, more than 100,000 years ago in the transportation network layer, all the world founders had never thought that the transportation network layer would develop to such a level. At this time, almost every world had fallen into a tribulation. Over the past hundreds of thousands of years, every world connected to the transportation network layer had been noticed by the tribulation layer. Every world had been drowned by the power of the tribulation, completely immersed in the tribulation and suffering the increasingly powerful and terrifying Great Tribulation of the world. Among them, some of the Great Tribulations were the first Great Tribulation of the world, while some had already begun the second Great Tribulation. Among these many worlds, there were even some that could no longer withstand the impact of the Great Tribulation of the world. Now, they had either lost their own world or perished along with their own world. Of course, these worlds were generally the kind that hadn't communicated with the heavenly Tao incarnation of Luo Fan's world of laws and time, or rather, had made a deal with it. If there was a world that could react in time, communicate with the world of laws and time, and invite the heavenly Tao incarnation of the world of laws and time, no matter how bad the outcome was, it could still maintain itself in the tribulation. Although it wouldn't directly overcome the Great Tribulation of the world, it wouldn't be completely destroyed in the Great Tribulation either. Such worlds were generally those that had already distanced themselves from the world of laws, or those that had sensed that the world of laws had some means against them. Some of these worlds would rather die than have anything to do with the world of laws, while some had regretted it in the end. This situation made many of the founders start to feel suspicious. The world founders couldn't tell what was going on with the worlds that had distanced themselves from the world of laws. They didn't know what they were worried about. All they saw was that the degree of danger they faced when they distanced themselves from the world of laws and faced the Great Tribulation of the world. Under such circumstances, those worlds began to take the initiative to get closer to the world of laws. This kind of closeness created all kinds of conflicts between them. This kind of conflict was extremely subtle, and it was a conflict of status in the transportation network layer. Due to this conflict, although the distance between the many worlds was extremely far, to the point that it couldn't even be measured by real distance, their positions in the transportation network layer would still clash. However, their positions in the transportation network layer would still conflict, and they could not coexist. As a result, it triggered some kind of war for position. The scale of this war was sporadic at the beginning, but it eventually became very noisy and almost became the mainstream of the transportation network layer. Most of these worlds were actually caused by the tribulations. Even if they acted as if there were no tribulations, that was only because the heavenly Tao incarnation of the world of laws was helping them suppress the tribulations in their worlds. Under such circumstances, the impact of the war became greater and greater. Under this influence, the tribulations between the many worlds actually began to fuse, interfere with each other, and influence each other. Under this interference and influence, the heavenly Tao incarnation began to find it more and more difficult to deal with. At first, it was still able to completely suppress the tribulations, preventing the worlds from showing any signs of the tribulations. But as time passed, as the war between the worlds became more and more intense, the signs gradually began to appear. And the appearance of these signs increased the danger of the worlds, causing the blows the worlds suffered in the war to become greater and greater. This, in turn, began to push the war to continue to intensify, making the war more and more terrifying. If time continued like this, the war would continue to intensify, and in the end, the entire transportation network layer would be completely involved in it. It might even completely include Luo Fan's world of laws, causing an impact that was many times more severe than it was now. However, this transportation network layer was obviously Luo Fan's transportation network layer. Everything here was built by him, and everything here was also under his control. One day, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable danger surging in his heart. He couldn't help but return to his senses from the state of trying to transform his cultivation realm, and shifted his attention to the entire transportation network layer outside. The moment he saw the changes in the transportation network layer, he couldn't help but feel a little lost. What's going on? What benefits are there for them to fight over? Why are they starting such a tragic war? Looking at the war, he couldn't understand what the many world founders were fighting over at all. There was definitely a struggle for benefits in a war. Even if it was a war caused by hatred, there would still be the pleasure of revenge. But now, Luo Fan didn't know what benefits there were in the transportation network layer for the world's founders to compete with each other. It could make those founders of heaven and earth carry out this kind of war without regard for anything else. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. He only needed to observe the form of the war to completely guess what they were fighting over. They're actually fighting for a position in the transportation network layer. How did they come up with such a misunderstanding? After discovering this, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel between laughter and tears. At this time, he felt sorry for the world founders who had lost everything in the war. This war is completely meaningless. He sighed and said, this sentence instantly spread out of the world of laws, and in the blink of an eye, it flowed along the many paths in the transportation network layer, directly passing through all the worlds that were connected to the transportation network layer and entered the ears of the world founders. The moment they heard this sentence, the world founders couldn't help but be stunned. They obviously didn't expect Luo Fan to actually make such a judgment on their war at this time. This was actually very easy to understand. It was obviously impossible for the beginning of the war to enter such a fierce level all of a sudden. The beginning of the war would definitely start from probing each other. And from the beginning of the probing, Luo Fan actually already had the opportunity to discover the signs of their war and had the opportunity to stop it. However, it had been tens of thousands of years since the beginning of the war, but Luo Fan didn't care about their war at all, nor did he interfere with their fight at all. Under such circumstances, no matter how they thought about it, they would feel that Luo Fan didn't care about this war at all, and might even want to see this war. This mentality had almost been deeply engraved in the hearts of all the world founders. It was precisely because of this that they completely ignored the possible reactions that Luo Fan might have made over the years, and instead just fought each other for a position in the transportation network layer. However, they didn't expect that at this time, when they had almost regarded the understanding that Luo Fan wouldn't care about their war as common sense. Luo Fan actually spoke. He actually directly declared that their war was completely meaningless. How could these pioneers of heaven and earth accept such a thing? Sir, what do you mean? Why is our war meaningless? One of the heaven and earth creator asked carefully. This world founder was the world founder of the world closest to Luo Fan's world of laws. According to the goal of the war, it was obvious that this world had already walked to the forefront of the war and obtained the most victories among the many worlds. Hearing this, Luo Fan just sighed and said, whether you're close or far from me doesn't have any effect on whether you've passed the Great Tribulation or not. No matter how close or far away you are from me, it won't change, unless you let me directly help you with the incarnation of the heavenly law. Many world founders were stunned at this moment. Chapter 2768. At that moment, the many founders in the transportation network suddenly understood how the living beings in the worlds they created felt towards them. That feeling was probably the same as what they were feeling right now. It was the feeling that they had turned into ants, that everything was under the control of other existences, and that their own power could not shake that fact at all. Although Luo Fan had only said such a sentence, they could not doubt him at all. Those words were like the truth, like the great Tao, directly engraved in the depths of their hearts, making them instinctively revere and not dare to have any thoughts of resisting. It was precisely because of the powerful ability of his voice that the entire transportation network layer fell into a complete silence because of his words. Luo Fan looked at the many worlds that had fallen into silence. He did not show anything on his face, and only felt that everything was as it should be. How could this be? That was the only thought in the minds of the founders at that moment. They naturally did not doubt what Luo Fan said at that moment. Although they were unwilling, their instincts and even their rationality told them that those words were true. There was no need to say much about their instincts. Those words directly penetrated their instincts and their hearts, eliminating their instinctive rejection and vigilance. That naturally made them believe those words instinctively. As for their rationality, there was no need to say much. Everything was clearly in the hands of Luo Fan, and there was no need for Luo Fan to lie to them. Their deaths were really not worth it. Some of the founders smiled bitterly. Why did they suddenly become so fanatical? Some of the founders began to think about the various abnormalities from before. No matter how one looked at it, the outbreak of this war was too sudden. According to their temperaments, they should not have so easily broken out into conflicts with other worlds. Even if a conflict broke out, they should not have fallen into the quagmire of war. However, it was as if their rationality had been obscured by something before. They actually became impulsive and irritable, like firecrackers that would explode at the slightest touch. In the end, the war broke out and developed to an almost unmanageable state. They did not feel that at that time, but now that they had woken up, they felt that there were flaws everywhere. Could it be that he is scheming against us? Suddenly, the hearts of some pioneers shook slightly, and they turned their gazes towards the world that was still changing incessantly at the center. In the transportation network layer, the only one who had the ability to cover their rationality and make them irritable and agitated seemed to be the master of the core world, Luo Fan. If it was him, why would he stop us from continuing to fight? Could it be that he has already achieved his goal? The Heaven and Earth founder continued to ponder, and his hair stood on end. If he continued to think in this direction, then all the previous situations seemed to have an explanation. Moreover, even if Luo Fan had stopped them from continuing to fight, there seemed to be some explanations from the details. This kind of situation was like associating. If two completely unrelated things were innately connected, then the more one looked at it, the more likely it was that there was a connection. At this time, this was the case for the creator of this world. Luo Fan actually had no direct connection with the war itself. However, the more he thought about it, the more he started to find all sorts of specious reasons. Or rather, he started to create them. The benefits that Luo Fan might obtain were also constantly being produced in this process. This kind of thinking was not the mainstream. But obviously, it was not just one world founder who thought this way. At this time, more and more world founders began to look at Luo Fan's world and the center of the transportation network layer with an inexplicable glint in their eyes. Luo Fan was naturally unaware of all this. After all, it was impossible for him to grasp the thoughts of those world founders. For him, he, who had not participated in this war at all, had a clear conscience. As someone who had a clear conscience, how could he have guessed that the other world founders would think that he was the mastermind? If he did not think in this direction, it was naturally impossible for him to discover that the other world founders had pinned all of this on him. At this time, he only continued to transform the improvement of his worldview into the improvement of his cultivation realm. After tens of millions of years of accumulation, he was actually nearing the end of this process. In other words, it was coming to an end. At this moment, compared to before, his cultivation had actually increased by quite a bit. At this moment, if his cultivation realm was measured according to the number of tribulations, it was equivalent to reaching the peak of the seventh tribulation. Currently, he was undergoing his seventh tribulation, and he still could not see the direction of this tribulation. However, his cultivation realm had unknowingly risen to the peak of the seventh tribulation. This strength and speed of improvement was enough to shock anyone. Even he felt inexplicably excited at this moment, and his heart was filled with boundless confidence. To face the seventh tribulation with the strength of the peak of the seventh tribulation, no matter what was special about this seventh tribulation, he had absolute confidence that he could easily overcome it. Not to mention that his cultivation realm had yet to reach the limit. Perhaps when he completely transformed the growth of his worldview into the improvement of his cultivation realm could undergo a qualitative change, and he could finally break through the limit and step into the eighth tribulation. Although this hope was very small, it was not zero, and it was worth looking forward to. It was because of this good mood that he did not pay much attention to the thoughts of the many world founders in the transportation network layer, nor did he pay attention to their doubts about him. Time continued to pass. In the blink of an eye, another few thousand years passed. In the transportation network layer, many heavens and earths had completely recovered from the absurd war that had just occurred. At the very least, on the surface, they had recovered from the war. Apart from the world founders who had completely perished in the war, even the world founders who had lost their own worlds in the war had used methods to reestablish their own worlds in the past few thousand years. Although the newly established worlds were much weaker than the original worlds, and they still needed to grow a few times before they could catch up to the original worlds. However, with these newly established worlds, the world founders were no longer as unconcealed as before, and they could communicate with other world founders on equal footing. Of course, the overall situation seemed to have recovered, but the hatred created by the war couldn't possibly disappear just like that. Their own worlds were destroyed, and the fruits of their hard work over billions of years were wiped out. How could this be a simple hatred? The fact that they didn't fight to the death with the other party was already a sign that they were rational and strong enough. How could they still have no grudges like in the beginning? With the passage of time, the opinion that Luo Fan was the mastermind behind the scenes began to spread and was gradually known by more and more creators of the world. Most world founders didn't believe this, but there were also a small number of world founders who believed it to be the truth when they heard this possibility. Along with this change, the positions of the many worlds in the transportation network layer started to shift. More and more world founders started to move towards the edge of the transportation network layer, causing the area closest to the world they were fighting for to gradually become empty. After thousands of years, the appearance of the entire transportation network has become like a donut. If Luo Fan was paying attention to the situation in the transportation network layer, he would have been able to tell from the changes that the creators of the world were already at odds with him. But it was a pity that Luo Fan wasn't in the mood to pay attention to this at this moment. The mentality of many world founders was reflected in the position of the world, and as the position of the world shifted, it gradually affected the mentality of more and more world founders. Even the world creators who regarded that suspicion as nonsense had their own firm confidence gradually wavered as more and more world creators became disloyal to Luo Fan and began to shift their own worlds backwards. After all, they instinctively denied the possibility that Luo Fan was the mastermind behind the scenes, and that was only based on their understanding of Luo Fan. There wasn't any strong evidence to prove that this was nonsense at all. Clearly, an understanding of living beings was the most unreliable guarantee. No one dared to say that they had a complete understanding of another person. No one dared to say that the other person they knew was the real person. It was the same for world founders like them. Moreover, Luo Fan had always been unfathomable and mysterious in their eyes. Under such circumstances, how could these world founders dare to say that their understanding of Luo Fan's method was everything about Luo Fan? How could they dare to say that the judgment they made based on their understanding of Luo Fan was really the truth? Under such circumstances, they naturally couldn't persist in this argument forever, and they would naturally be gradually affected by the attitudes of other world founders. As more and more world founders began to doubt Luo Fan, they would also unknowingly follow suit. Unknowingly, they would allow their own world to follow the flow of the general flow and begin to drift away from the direction of the world of laws. In this way, the empty area near Luo Fan's world of laws became larger and larger. In the end, after thousands of years, Luo Fan's world of laws, which should have been the core area of the entire transportation network layer, became like a rural area and became lonely. There was no world at all in the vast area, and only some roads connected many worlds to the world of laws. On this day, the world of laws trembled slightly, and some kind of indescribable fluctuation erupted from the world of laws. It swept through the entire transportation network layer in the blink of an eye. These fluctuations were so wonderful and incredible. In the process of being released, they directly penetrated the interior of many worlds, penetrated all the defenses of many worlds, and even penetrated the many world founders, making them feel as if all their secrets have been snatched away by these fluctuations. What's going on? All the world founders were shocked at this moment. They could understand why these fluctuations were so powerful. After all, they came from Luo Fan, the unfathomable and powerful existence that they didn't know what he had been doing all this time. Although it was somewhat unexpected for him to have such an ability, they could actually understand it. After all, this was still within the scope that they could accept. However, at this time, Luo Fan released these fluctuations and faced them with such an attitude, which made them feel a little puzzled. This wasn't a special time. In the transportation network layer, there wasn't a trace of abnormality between the many worlds. All the world founders, all the worlds, and everything was operating according to the original rules. At such a very ordinary time, why would Luo Fan need to use such fluctuations to clean up the entire transportation network layer? However, many world founders soon understood that Luo Fan wasn't targeting them. At this time, this kind of cleaning wasn't Luo Fan's real intention or purpose. The fluctuations at this time were actually just the aftermath of the changes in Luo Fan's world of laws. Or rather, it was just the aftermath of the changes in Luo Fan's body. At this moment, they could already see that the world of laws seemed to have turned into a huge living being that began to stretch and shrink like a heartbeat. It was as if some unimaginable power had instantly activated the world of laws. At the same time, Luo Fan's projection appeared above the world, as if he had suddenly turned into a giant and sat cross-legged where the world was. In that instant, many of the founders of the world felt that it wasn't the world of laws there, but Luo Fan. Chapter 2770. All sorts of distortions continued to spread in all directions. It was naturally impossible for the surrounding heavens and earths to be so coincidental that they would be affected. During this process, there were still some worlds that were within the range of the fluctuations. Under the influence of the fluctuations, they began to distort and collapse. Instead of being destroyed by the great calamity, they were going to be destroyed by the subtle changes of Luo Fan's world of laws. Fortunately, the worlds closest to Luo Fan's world of laws had already made deals with Luo Fan. In other words, they were worlds that already possessed the embodiment of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws. At this moment, the incarnation of the heavenly Tao that belonged to the world began to take action. It manipulated the power of the world and began to display various changes. It used all kinds of subtle means and indescribable power to make the world obey the terrifying fluctuations. It managed to protect the world under the influence of the fluctuations with great difficulty. At the very least, it prevented those worlds from collapsing completely. As for the losses, it was inevitable. This influence even shook the foundation of the entire transportation network layer, causing the entire transportation network layer to tremble slightly. The connections between many worlds and the roads between them seemed to be shrouded in some sort of strange mist. This situation made the hearts of many world founders shrouded in a strong sense of unease. The existence of the transportation network layer was both a restraint and a form of support for the many founders of the world. The restraint was because of the existence of the transportation network layer and the world of laws. At this moment, they already had a lot of doubts about the world of laws and Luo Fan, and they no longer dared to trust Luo Fan. It was because of the existence of the transportation network that they were not lonely. It allowed them to communicate with the other founders of the world, and it allowed them to find their own kind in the simulated state of chaos. If there was no transportation network, then they might not be able to escape the influence of Luo Fan's world of laws. However, they would definitely lose their other companions. They would lose the many founders of the world that had gradually become their daily routine and had become a matter of course for them. Realizing this situation, how could the world founders not feel a strong sense of unease? Under this strong sense of unease, some of the world founders began to contact each other. They began to discuss how to contact each other after the collapse of the transportation network layer, and how to reestablish a similar chaotic simulation layer. Of course, these were only a minority of the world's founders. More pioneers of heaven and earth clearly understood how difficult it was to connect, and even more clearly understood how dangerous it was to connect. Therefore, at this time, they were only watching cautiously and did not really take any action. As for the various situations in the traffic network layer, Luo Fan was just like before, completely ignoring them. At this time, he was just trying his best to restrain himself and separate himself from the world of laws. Along with this change, the world of laws, which looked like it had transformed into Luo Fan's body, had returned to its original appearance. It was as if it had turned into a group of worlds that was constantly growing and expanding. At the same time, the connection between the many parallel locations, which had been opened up to allow ordinary beings to pass through, had already shrunk. Although it wasn't as if it had completely disappeared, as if it didn't exist anymore, it was no longer possible for ordinary living beings to pass through. Under this change, the great changes in the entire world of laws began to gradually slow down. Although the influence of living beings from different parallel universes entering other parallel universes would be endless, under the influence of the parallel universes themselves, the influence would only diminish with the passage of time. Because of the existence of the connections between many parallel locations, this influence could not completely disappear in the end, but it would no longer cause as much danger as before. After fully recovering, Luo Fan let out a long breath. I almost suffer a backlash. At this moment, he truly felt that the most important thing he needed to do was to reorganize his worldview and his cultivation realm. He used temporary ideas to make up for his worldview. Although it brought him endless benefits for a while, it also planted hidden dangers. If he didn't pay attention to it, the change just now would be the most likely outcome. If he wasn't vigilant enough, he might be completely changed by those worldviews and become no longer himself. In a way, his previous behavior could be said to be not worth it. However, it was obvious that this method was unavoidable. At least, based on his current understanding, the cultivation method, just now, that obviously had many hidden dangers was unavoidable. There was no other reason than because he needed a foundation and a framework. Even though there were too many problems with this foundation and this framework, it was still indispensable. It was like building a building that was dozens of floors tall. Could the initial design be completed in one go? Could it be that he could immediately complete the final design just by starting to draw? A real design would always need to be designed, modified, and perfected over and over again before it could be formed. For Luo Fan, his worldview was the initial design, the most basic structure. If he didn't have the initial design, what foundation would he use to modify these designs? What foundation would he use to perfect these ideas? Therefore, even if these ideas had many hidden dangers and might eventually change his own thinking and will, these were unavoidable. Even if there was such a danger, he had to do it. Fortunately, he could clearly recognize this. unlike other cultivators who didn't feel any abnormalities at all. As long as he could clearly recognize this, it was equivalent to clearly knowing the imperfections in a certain design and clearly understanding the parts that should be modified. This was equivalent to completely marking out the possible hidden dangers. In this way, the possibility of being affected was much smaller than usual. At least, as long as Luo Fan wasn't too careless, he wouldn't really be affected and really end up in an irreversible situation. After sorting out the many ideas and carefully experiencing the various situations of the ideas, Luo Fan finally relaxed. At least for now, it hadn't really affected him. After relaxing, he just noticed the situation in the transportation network layer at this moment. Luo Fan was the core, the ruler, and even the creator of the entire transportation network layer. How could any changes in the transportation network layer escape his detection? With his ability, in an instant, he completely understood the changes in the transportation network layer over the past few days, and he understood the concerns of the many world founders. At this moment, his expression changed slightly. It's developing too quickly. Normally, it wouldn't be like this without tens of millions of years. At this moment, he didn't directly blame the other world founders, but he immediately felt that something was wrong. It was very normal for the many world founders in the transportation network layer to discover the abnormality, be wary of him, and even start to reject him. After all, the nature of the transportation network layer was right there. In the transportation network layer, the situation where Luo Fan's world of laws was superior to many worlds was not concealed at all. Under such circumstances, the world founders would be able to sense the abnormality after a long time. As a result, they would become dissatisfied with Luo Fan and reject the world of laws. This was not surprising at all. However, according to his calculations, it would still take at least tens of millions of years for these thoughts to completely erupt. But at this time, how long had it been in the transportation network layer? It had only been a short few 100,000 years. In just a few 100,000 years, they had actually completed the change in thinking that would have taken tens of millions of years before. This situation didn't seem right no matter how he looked at it. Is it some kind of shackle or something else? Luo Fan thought to himself as he sensed the transportation network layer very carefully, feeling the slightest change in it. Everything in the transportation network layer was within his senses. At this moment, under his will, all the hidden secrets were revealed without reservation. At this moment, the many world founders in the transportation network layer could clearly feel some kind of will probing all their secrets from the inside out. The strength of this probing was tens of thousands of times stronger than the fluctuations they had sensed before. At this moment, they could clearly feel that everything about them was no longer hidden in the other party's eyes. What is this? You're no longer trying to hide it? At this moment, the founders of the universe were filled with intense anger. It was a kind of anger directed at Luo Fan, a kind of anger directed at their own fate. One had to know that the pioneers of the world actually thought highly of themselves. As the world founders and the creators of countless living beings, they definitely did not think that they were inferior to other living beings. Even if it was Luo Fan, they only thought that they were temporarily inferior to him in terms of strength. In essence, they did not think that Luo Fan could really surpass them. However, at this moment, they were humiliated once again. In their opinion, Luo Fan's probing of them was a direct insult to them. Waves of anger surged from the bottom of their hearts and gradually surged towards their worlds. The anger of some world founders even rushed out of their own worlds and surged into the transportation network layer. Gradually, it affected a larger and larger area of the transportation network layer, causing more and more areas of the transportation network layer to be infected. Gradually, a change that many world founders could not have anticipated occurred. An existence similar to the power of a tribulation was born from the anger. At this moment, Luo Fan instantly grasped the anger. He slightly furrowed his brows, and a faint cold glint appeared in his eyes. Tribulation level. At this moment, he had already grasped the root of everything. He had grasped the root of the rejection and hostility of many world founders in the transportation network layer. The root of everything was the tribulation level, or rather, it was the power of the tribulation. At this moment, he suddenly felt that the tribulation power contained in many worlds was already faintly resonating with him. The resonance wasn't obvious, and it could even be said to be faintly discernible. If it wasn't for the various powers brought about by the fury of the founders of the world, he might not even be able to sense the existence of the resonance. The effect of this resonance was none other than treating the various worlds as units. The power of the tribulations in the various worlds was the most basic detail, and they were connected together. As the silver-gray resonance resonated, the power of the tribulations in the various worlds became a small part of a huge whole. The effect of this huge whole was none other than to impose a tribulation on the transportation network layer. It was to make the transportation network layer undergo a test. Even the simulated chaos layer is going to encounter a tribulation. At this moment, Luo Fan had already found a deeper root. The tribulation level clearly could not have the will of a living being. At least for now, Luo Fan had not found any signs of the will of a living being. Since that was the case, the tribulation level could be regarded as some kind of rule without the will of a living being. Under such circumstances, any changes in the tribulation level would obviously follow the rule. The tribulation level began to exert changes on the transportation network layer and began to pour its power into the transportation network layer. This clearly showed that according to the fundamental rule of the tribulation level, the transportation network layer itself needed to be attacked by the tribulation power and be tested by the tribulation power. The effect of this attack and this test was rather mysterious and obscure. It was something that ordinary world founders could not understand. However, a test was a test, and an attack was an attack. Its existence would inevitably gradually change the transportation network layer, gradually changing the many worlds in the transportation network layer, and even the world founders. Chapter 2771. The various anomalies in the transportation network layer were the result of the tribulation layer's effect on the tribulation power that simulated the chaos layer's tribulation power. This kind of power was mysterious and subtle. It scattered and fused with the many worlds in the simulated chaotic layer. It appeared in the form of the great tribulation of the world, and even disappeared in the form of the great tribulation of the world. But in essence, they were the tribulation of the simulated chaos layer. This was a kind of tribulation that Luo Fan had never seen before, and he didn't even know that it existed. Does this exist in the true state of chaos, or is it just a tribulation that exists in this simulated state of chaos? At this time, such doubts emerged in Luo Fan's mind. Almost everything in the simulated chaos layer was constructed according to the real chaos layer. This included the endless worlds, the great tribulation of the world, and the experiences of the creators of the world when they entered the simulated chaos layer. Everything was constructed according to the real chaos layer. Everything that existed here in the real chaos layer had a great possibility of having a corresponding reality. Perhaps there would be a difference in the performance, and it might even be as different as the sky and the earth, but the similarity of the root could definitely be found. Since everything else was constructed according to the real chaos layer, then was this tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer, or rather, the tribulation that targeted the simulated chaos layer, also existing in the real chaos layer? Could it be that the true chaos layer would also need to suffer such a tribulation and endure such a tribulation? There was almost no doubt about the answer to this question. At this moment, Luo Fan had already given an affirmative answer in the first place. Everything else was real, and everything else had a corresponding reality. Why couldn't the tribulation of the simulated chaos layer have a corresponding reality in the real chaos layer? Was it because this reality was something that Luo Fan had never heard of or even thought of before? How is this possible? Since he admitted that everything else had a corresponding reality, then obviously he could only admit that this tribulation also had a corresponding reality. The chaotic layer also has such a tribulation? Then, doesn't that mean that even the great heaven and earth might not be truly without tribulations and immeasurable? As this thought emerged in Luo Fan's mind, his expression became inexplicably complicated. A perfect heaven and earth could transform into a great heaven and earth after going through 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth. In the end, it would be like a living being becoming a true sage, with no tribulations and immeasurable, eternal, and indestructible. This was a concept that had been established ever since he learned about the nature of the Great Tribulation. Apart from perfecting his worldview, Luo Fan's greatest dream had always been to help the primordial world survive the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth and the world of laws that he had created. But now, he realized that going through the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth and transforming heaven and earth into the grand heaven and earth might not be the end. That perhaps was only the beginning. Tribulations would still follow him like a shadow, and they could still affect the world. Although it wasn't enough to overturn his view of the world, it still made him feel complicated and indescribable, and he couldn't sort out his thoughts for a while. However, the harvest of this tribulation transcendence is beyond my imagination. Then he suddenly smiled, and there was an inexplicable excitement in his eyes. Directly coming into contact with the chaotic state and experiencing it from a macroscopic perspective was obviously still extremely far away for him. After all, with his current strength, he could only use his perception to slightly break through the barrier of the world and come into contact with the chaotic state. The chaotic state that he obtained would be like an ant lying on the body of an elephant and trying to determine what the universe the elephant was like by detecting the situation around the elephant. Perhaps, at some point, this ant's intelligence would explode, and it would be able to see through the various subtle phenomena and figure out the past, present, and future of the entire universe through various subtle signs, just like how a physicist could figure out what the universe the elephant was like. However, it was obvious that the probability of that happening was extremely small. Luo Fan's current size was equivalent to that of an ant. The world he was attached to, no matter which world it was equivalent to that elephant. The chaotic state that he wanted to understand was equivalent to the universe that the elephant was in. Under such circumstances, if he were to directly face the chaotic state, one could imagine how difficult it would be for him to truly establish an overall model of the chaotic state and correctly understand the entire chaotic state given his strength and level. It could be said that under normal circumstances, unless he became a true sage, he would not even think of such a possibility. However, in this great calamity, the simulated chaotic state had given him a great opportunity. Compared to the real chaotic state, the simulated chaotic state was like a model of the real chaotic state. Be it in terms of size or level, this model was far inferior to the real chaotic state. Therefore, Luo Fan, who was the same size as the ant, already had the opportunity to figure out the true appearance of the entire model and the appearance of the real chaotic state that the model referred to. For example, it was almost impossible for the ant to figure out the entire universe outside the body of the elephant. However, although it was not easy to figure out the appearance of the elephant and understand its many characteristics, it had become possible from the original almost impossible. To Luo Fan, the simulated chaotic state was obviously like an ant to an elephant. This time, Luo Fan was almost reluctant to get through the 7th tribulation so quickly. At this moment, he felt even more clearly that the great tribulations that he had encountered were actually opportunities given to him by the chaotic state. In other words, the chaotic state was an opportunity for the cultivators who walked the path of the opposite direction. The disciples of the true sages had always felt that walking the path of the opposite direction was against the path of cultivation and the rules of the chaotic state. The tribulations that they encountered were signs that the chaotic state was dissatisfied. However, at this moment, he felt that perhaps the cultivators who walked the path of the opposite direction were what the chaotic state wanted to see. These tribulations might not be the punishment of the chaotic state, but the benefits that the chaotic state gave them. It was the chaotic state that nurtured them. Of course, one naturally could not expect the chaotic state to take care of one in every possible way like a parent. The opportunity and benefits were given to one, but one did not grasp them. If one could not even withstand the test of the benefits, then one could only blame oneself for being useless. The chaotic state could not be blamed at all. All these thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression gradually calmed down. Let me see what kind of tribulations this is. Luo Fan's eyes flickered, and the transportation network layer in his eyes began to undergo subtle changes. The originally empty transportation network layer was instantly shrouded in an indescribable layer of fog. This fog was faintly discernible, and seemed to exist at the same time. However, it was constantly seeping into all the roads in the transportation network layer, including the heaven and earth. At this moment, even the heaven and earth were enduring the infiltration of this fog. This fog clearly possessed the characteristics of a tribulation layer. In other words, it was a type of tribulation power. It constantly remained in the tribulation layer, pouring into the transportation network layer, passing through many heaven and earth, and finally fusing into the depths of the transportation network layer. It was starting to brew something within. What a wonderful tribulation. I wonder what kind of tribulation the universe would encounter in the true chaotic state layer. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. The universe itself had already gone through 9 great tribulations of the universe. In essence, such a universe was already without tribulations and immeasurable. However, he now realized that the universe might still encounter tribulations, and perhaps it would still be targeted by tribulations. After all, it was impossible for the universe to exist outside of the chaotic state layer. The chaotic state layer itself was just an abstraction of the universe's influence on the chaotic state. In this way, as long as the universe was in a chaotic state, it would naturally establish a chaotic state layer, or rather, a chaotic layer. This nature wouldn't be different depending on whether the universe was a perfect universe or universe. Since that was the case, as long as the universe didn't break free from the chaotic state, it would definitely attach itself to a chaotic layer. Perhaps it was built by itself, or perhaps it was built by another universe. And obviously, if Luo Fan's conjecture was the truth, in other words, any chaos stratum would definitely encounter a tribulation. Then, didn't it mean that the chaos stratum where the great heaven and earth would also encounter a tribulation? And the chaotic layer in the universe obviously wouldn't encounter tribulations at the same time. Moreover, it was impossible for all the universes in a chaotic layer to be the universe. In this case, it was impossible for the universe to not encounter tribulations in the chaotic layer. If that was the case, what would happen to the universe during the tribulations? If the universe was also attacked by tribulations, it would also collapse and perish in the tribulations. Wouldn't that contradict the fact that the universe itself was without tribulations and immeasurable? However, if the tribulations couldn't affect the universe, then what was the point of the tribulations in the chaotic layer's existence? Therefore, there must be some mechanism in the universe that Luo Fan couldn't understand to resolve this contradiction, so that the paradox between the universe and the chaotic layer, which couldn't coexist, could be alleviated. As he pondered, Luo Fan turned his gaze to the vast tribulation layer that shrouded the transportation network layer. At this moment, countless passageways extended from the tribulation layer, connecting the various universes in the transportation network layer. In the past, Luo Fan didn't think that there was anything special about these passageways. At most, he felt that they were more densely packed. But now, after his understanding had changed, he understood that the many passageways were actually many things that were one. Behind these passageways, there was an even larger passageway. These passageways were actually scattered from that huge passageway. As his understanding changed, he looked again and found that the countless passageways were like rays of the sun, radiating in all directions from a single point. It felt like a huge umbrella. The top of the umbrella was where the tribulation layer touched. All the tribulation passageways originated from this point, from the vast tribulation world behind this point. That's right. At this moment, Luo Fan could clearly see that the countless tribulations in the transportation network layer came from an extremely complete and extremely strange tribulation world. That world was hidden in the tribulation layer and was vague. Even with Luo Fan's perception, he could only vaguely grasp that world. As for the specific appearance of that world, he couldn't see it clearly. While Luo Fan was observing the situation in the transportation network layer and the tribulation layer, the many heaven and earth founders in the transportation network layer had already made further moves. Those heaven and earth founders couldn't directly grasp the root of the changes in the transportation network layer like Luo Fan could. To them, all their changes were because they had seen the truth and recognized the conspiracy of Luo Fan in the center of the transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, they naturally wouldn't think too much about other things. At this time, they were just looking for a chance to break free from the restrictions and misfortune they encountered. The actions of these heaven and earth founders at this time were not to directly attack the laws of the world, but to attack the paths that were connected to them. They began to use all means and methods to completely cut off these paths. Although these heaven and earth founders were much weaker than Luo Fan, they were still heaven and earth founders after all. They were existences that could create heaven and earth in this simulated state of chaos. How could they not understand the transportation network layer after being in the transportation network layer for such a long time? How could they not have studied the roads in the transportation network layer at all? Chapter 2772. The entire transportation network layer fell into endless chaos in the blink of an eye. Many of the world founders had their own thoughts and ways to deal with it. If it was before, they might have discussed things rationally and cautiously so that they could interfere with each other as little as possible so that they would not drag each other down. However, this was clearly something that would only happen under normal circumstances. What was happening in the transportation network layer was clearly not normal. Here, it was a tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer. In such a tribulation, things that were clearly beneficial to the world founders might not necessarily satisfy the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, under the indescribable manipulation of the tribulation, the world founders' actions became like this. Their methods influenced and interfered with each other, and in the end, they could not achieve their goals. In the end, none of them could truly sever those paths and achieve their goals. On the contrary, the damage to the transportation network layer was getting bigger and bigger as time passed, becoming more and more shocking. At this moment, Luo Fan was paying close attention to all of this, and his expression became solemn. Above the tribulation layer was a world that released endless tribulations. Although it looked rather small from here, in reality, it contained extremely many things, and its structure was indescribably complex. Just by sensing it from afar, Luo Fan could already sense an extremely vast and powerful aura from it. Under this aura, the power of the countless tribulations released from the world seemed to be moving in a seemingly random manner, but was actually following some indescribable law. These various movements caused the tribulations in the world to change, and the minds of the world founders were also vaguely affected. Suddenly, at a certain moment, under all sorts of seemingly coincidental changes that were actually inevitable, the power released by the many founders of the world interweaved with each other and gave birth to boundless vitality. They formed countless living beings that appeared on the roads of the transportation network layer. As soon as these living beings appeared, they began to increase and sublimate at an unimaginable speed. In the beginning, they were extremely weak and could only live and die as they pleased. They could not even gain a foothold in the transportation network layer. However, as time passed and the various changes triggered by the power of the world's founders, the living beings began to strengthen rapidly and gradually gained a foothold on the transportation network layer. Once they gained a foothold, these living beings began to expand outwards. The transportation network layer could accommodate countless worlds. Although many of the paths did not truly follow the principles of space and time, under the senses of living beings, they were definitely larger than all the worlds combined. In such a place, one could imagine how much space there was for these creatures to expand and survive. It could be said that the number of living beings in this world could not even compare to the number of living beings in this world, let alone the fact that these living beings were still extremely rare. Even if all the living beings in the countless worlds were captured and stuffed into the many roads in the transportation network layer, the roads in the transportation network layer would never become crowded. Because they were creatures born in the transportation network layer, they were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. In other words, the living beings that could truly stabilize and gain a foothold in the transportation network layer were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. The living beings that did not fit in the transportation network layer had clearly been completely eliminated in the previous birth and death. Under such circumstances, the way these living beings expanded was very different from that of ordinary living beings in the world. They did not want to expand area by area, but they were radiating towards the entire transportation network layer. In other words, they did not start from the beginning and continuously expand in all directions, eventually radiating to the entire transportation network layer. Instead, when it began to expand, a huge number of living beings instantly flew to almost every location in the entire transportation network layer through the special characteristics of the transportation network layer. Then, they established a foothold in that location, multiplied, and finally brought that area under the control of living beings as well. It was as if countless water droplets were sprayed out from the starting point and turned into rain that covered the entire transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Just the mysteriousness of the transportation network layer itself was enough to pose a great threat to these living beings, causing them to encounter many unexpected environments from time to time. In the end, they would either defeat the environment or be eliminated by the environment. Not to mention, at this time, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were struggling with all their might, wanting to escape from the misfortune and trouble they now knew. In this situation where almost all the worlds were struggling, the chaos in the transportation network layer could be imagined. At this moment, almost every location was filled with incomparably chaotic power, and power was released everywhere, making it difficult to tidy up. Even if real cultivators entered such chaos, it would be difficult for them to survive, let alone these living beings who were only relying on their characteristics as natural living beings to survive in the transportation network layer. If they were really unlucky and encountered a chaotic region, it would be almost fatal for them. It was precisely because of this that the development speed of the living beings in the transportation network layer was restrained to a certain extent. Moreover, even those areas that were developing smoothly could not maintain true peace for a long time. Perhaps at this moment, everything was still stable and the world was beautiful. But in the next moment, the world might collapse and everything they were familiar with would completely collapse and disappear. However, since living beings had already been born, it was naturally impossible for them to stop developing. This was especially true for these living beings that were born from the transportation network layer. The birth of these living beings was obviously not really a coincidence, but a random result. Their birth was definitely the result of this so-called layer tribulation. And this tribulation clearly did not create these living beings just to fill up the empty roads in the transportation network layer. Although Luo Fan could not truly understand the meaning of the birth of these living beings, he understood that they must have their own goals, and it could even be said that they had their own conspiracies. If he did not pay attention to them, these living beings would definitely bring great damage to the transportation network layer one day. What a wonderful tribulation. After looking at the situation in the transportation network layer for a while, Luo Fan shifted his attention to his body and mind. Don't forget, a part of that tribulation had clearly penetrated the world of laws, and even his body. If he did not pay attention to it, who knew when that part of the tribulation that had penetrated the world would erupt with some power that he did not want to see, creating an outcome that he did not want to see? With a shout in his heart, Luo Fan's world of laws began to surge, quickly cleansing his body and mind, using an incomparably meticulous method to clean up the traces that existed inside and outside of his body and mind that had been penetrated by the tribulation's power. These traces were extremely obscure, and if he did not clearly know that the power had already penetrated his body, he might not have even discovered the existence of these traces. However, compared to other incomparably stubborn influences, the influence of these powers was much smaller. When he discovered the might of the tribulation, it was actually easily stripped away by her. Bit by bit, it was expelled out of his body and mind, and even further out of his world of laws. The whole process was indescribably smooth. It felt like a drop of oil had been dripped on a piece of plastic wrap. With just a light wipe, the drop of oil was completely wiped away. It seemed that the power of the tribulation couldn't truly integrate with the world of laws in him. Could it be because I've passed the third great tribulation? Feeling that the infiltration had been easily resolved, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. At this moment, he vaguely understood what the situation would be like when the tribulation appeared in the true state of chaos. Perhaps, at that time, the tribulation was nothing more than a performance for the world of laws. There were no tribulations in the world of laws, and the tribulation might be able to enter the world of laws because of the connection between the world of laws and the chaotic layer it was in. However, it would definitely not be able to truly shake the foundation of the world of laws, and it would definitely not be able to truly destroy the world of laws. If the ruler of the world of laws was willing to cooperate, the tribulation would naturally be able to receive some support from the world of laws, allowing the chaotic layer to be tested, tempered, and even obtain opportunities. However, if the world of laws was unwilling, then no matter how hard the tribulation tried, it would only be a problem that could be solved with a single thought. Of course, this was only his guess at this time. It was also a guess that he had made based on the situation of the world of laws at this time. As well as his own situation, it might be true, or it might be false. There might be some subtle differences, or it might be the complete opposite. As for the specifics, he could only be sure when he really reached that level in the future and encountered the real tribulation. Following this feeling, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. He must not directly interfere with the tribulation of the transportation network layer this time. If he interfered directly, this level of tribulation would definitely seep into his world of laws and affect his body. If he did not directly interfere, then no matter how the tribulation changed, even if the entire transportation network layer was completely destroyed, it would not affect him at all. At most, he would just lose the transportation network layer. Of course, this was the case for Luo Fan, because Luo Fan's world of laws had already gone through 3 great tribulations, and it had just passed the 3rd great tribulation. Because he had just passed the tribulation, the world of laws wouldn't care about him for the time being. Although it would not be as exaggerated as ignoring him, it would definitely not deliberately target him. Of course, this was only the case for Luo Fan. The situation was obviously not the same for the other worlds. For all the other worlds in the transportation network layer, the tribulation at this time was a test of life and death for them. Once they passed, then not only would they be able to integrate more closely with the transportation network layer, but they would even obtain a certain level of authority over the transportation network layer. Even their own worlds would be able to pass the great tribulation that they were currently encountering because of this. Of course, if they could not pass the tribulation, not only would they lose the connection brought by the transportation network layer, but even their own worlds might be destroyed because of this failure. The reason for this was that they were already a part of this tribulation, and it could even be said that they were the foundation of this tribulation. Once the tribulation succeeded, then their worlds would have to bear all the damage suffered by the transportation network layer at the same time. Once the tribulation failed, the tribulation that they encountered would also fail along with the tribulation. For them, the failure of the tribulation that their own worlds encountered would naturally mean that their own worlds had succeeded. Of course, for the many world founders, if they wanted to help the transportation network layer resist the tribulation, what they could do was very simple, and that was to refocus their attention on their own worlds and help them overcome the tribulation that their own worlds encountered as soon as possible. As mentioned before, the tribulation that their worlds encountered was a component of this tribulation. In this way, the tribulation of their own worlds was naturally a component that resisted the tribulation of the entire level. This kind of resistance was naturally aimed at the foundation of this level. It went without saying that the impact would be huge and the effect would be great. Of course, if the creator of the universe was truly powerful enough to directly face the tribulation of the entire transportation network layer and set off from the many paths in the transportation network layer and the macroscopic region that simulated the entire chaos layer created by the transportation network layer to resist the tribulation, the effect would certainly not be bad. However, it was obvious that apart from Luo Fan, none of the other world founders in the transportation network layer had such an ability. However, it's not like there's no way. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly began to rejoice over the various agreements that he had made with the other world founders. Chapter 2773. Although not every world had an incarnation of the heavenly Tao of the world of laws, it could be seen from the number of world creators that had made a deal with Luo Fan and placed their incarnations into the world of laws that existed parallel to the world of laws. It could be seen how huge the number of such worlds were. It could be said that there were heavenly Tao incarnations in most of the many worlds in the transportation network layer. Before this, these heavenly Tao incarnations were only working hard to complete the deal between Luo Fan and the creators. In other words, they were working hard to help the world survive the great tribulation that the world had encountered. Such behavior could not be said to be wrong. Before this, whether it was for the transportation network layer or for the world itself, it had great benefits. For the world, the heavenly Tao incarnations helping it resist the tribulation could naturally extend the time that the world existed, allowing it to have a chance to continue living forever. The benefits were self-evident. For the transportation network layer, the stability of the component nodes was also the stability of the entire transportation network layer, which was naturally a benefit. However, that was only in the past, before the heavenly tribulation descended. As the tribulation descended, this method could no longer be as beneficial to the whole and the parts as before. At this time, the heavenly Tao incarnation's behavior of helping the world was already guided by the power of the tribulation. Although they were still helping the world survive the great tribulation and were still protecting the world. However, on the whole, in the eyes of the entire transportation network layer, this behavior had already become a part of the tribulation. It had become a source of power for the tribulation. If Luo Fan did not change this situation, then the final collapse of the transportation network layer will be largely due to the various means used by the heavenly Tao incarnations. Luo Fan was naturally well aware of this. There were very few existences who could boldly claim that they were stronger than him in terms of understanding the tribulation. At the very least, besides true saints, amongst all the living beings that Luo Fan had encountered up until now, there was absolutely no one that dared to say that they had a deeper understanding of tribulations than him. After learning that the transportation network layer was facing a tribulation that was completely aimed at simulating the chaos layer, although he did not immediately know the nature of the tribulation, he saw through many facts that he had previously ignored. He knew the position of his heavenly axiom incarnation in the tribulation. At this time, he knew that he couldn't directly interfere with the level tribulation, so he immediately turned his attention to the heavenly Tao incarnations that were already part of the level tribulation. As his heart trembled slightly, the heavenly Tao incarnations that were helping the heavens and earth to resist the great calamity of the world all changed their actions. These incarnations of the heavenly Tao were the bridge between Luo Fan and the creator of heaven and earth. The incarnation of the heavenly Tao would help the world resist the great calamity of the world. This was part of the agreement. However, this did not mean that the heavenly axiom incarnation's actions could only follow a fixed procedure. It could not be changed or deviated. The truth was the exact opposite, even though there was such an agreement and such a deal. However, the freedom of the heavenly axiom incarnation was unimaginably great. The reason for this seemed inconceivable, but it was actually very reasonable. This was because there were just too many ways to help the world resist the great calamity of the world. Even if it did not violate the agreement between Luo Fan and the creator of heaven and earth, the heavenly axiom incarnation still had countless choices. However, it was not just doing what it had done for so many years. The reason why the heavenly axiom incarnation had chosen this method for so many years was not because this was the only method, but because this method could help the world perfectly. Now that this perfect method had been used by the level tribulation and had become part of the tribulation, Luo Fan naturally could not continue using this method. At this moment, indescribable tremors began to appear in the places where the incarnations of the heavenly Daos existed. The traces of the resistance between the world and the power of the tribulations that had originally been invisible erupted in an instant, blotting out the sky and covering the earth. For the living beings that were used to the peace of the world, this instantaneous change was like the world had turned upside down. They could not react in time at all, and they suffered huge losses in an instant. What's going on? You violated our deal. The creator of the heaven and earth seemed to have woken up from a dream and was furious. You guys seem to be resisting, Master. This is already a violation of the premise of the deal. Among the many worlds, the creator of the heaven and earth retorted with the same plain words. Moreover, we didn't violate the deal. Aren't we helping you resist the tribulation now? There's no fundamental difference from before. Following that, the creator of the heaven and earth completely cut off the source of their condemnation. At this moment, the creator of the heaven and earth felt like a bucket of ice water had been poured over their heads. All of them instantly recovered from the indescribable anger. At this time, they really recalled what the situation was like at this time, and what they were doing at this time meant to Luo Fan. After thinking about this, the creator of the heaven and earth, who still had some moral integrity, felt a little ashamed. Soon after, they sensed slightly and understood that although the situation in the entire world seemed terrible, it was controlled within a certain range. Although it looked terrifying, it did not really affect their world that much. After understanding this, their emotions became inexplicably complicated. It was clearly a little too much to blame the incarnations of the heavenly axioms. They were already thinking of ways to cut off their connection with their master. Under such circumstances, the incarnations of the heavenly axioms were still helping their world to resist the tribulation of the world. This kind of moral integrity was enough to make any existence admire them. If they still blamed the incarnations of the heavenly axioms under such circumstances, they would not be able to live up to their moral integrity. However, it was clearly very difficult for them to feel grateful to the incarnations of the heavenly axioms. After all, they clearly could have done better, and they had done it for so many years. Yet, they changed their methods and did not continue. Instead, they allowed their world to be continuously damaged by the tribulation, causing the living beings in the world to be continuously destroyed. Under such circumstances, how could they be reasonable enough to feel grateful? Under such circumstances, how could they not feel complicated about the incarnations of the heavenly axioms? As the behavior of the incarnations of the heavenly axioms in the world changed, the living beings that were born from the tribulation on the many roads in the transportation network layer also began to experience various changes. As if they had lost some sort of guidance, they became lost and chaotic. The modification of the roads in the transportation network layer and even the continuous expansion had stopped. Instead, they began to fall into internal strife. This situation seemed more like those living beings had suddenly awakened their selfishness. They were no longer as selfless as before, wholeheartedly serving their own race and the living beings that were born on the roads in the transportation network layer. Instead, they began to pursue their own interests and benefits. For ordinary living beings, this would be a good thing. It meant that they had begun to move towards true completion or even true perfection. However, it was clear that this was not a good thing for the entire race. As this change occurred, the process of the living beings' proliferation was gradually curbed. And as their proliferation was curbed, The modification of the roads by those living beings also gradually appeared. The results of their modification of the roads were also gradually revealed. The roads began to have a lot of energy continuously extracted and converted into energy that could be used by those living beings. These energy were converted into resources that those living beings could use to fight for their own interests and to seek for their own advancement. It looked like ordinary living beings were constantly demanding from the world in order to grow their own race or themselves. The reason why this was only seen during the civil strife was actually very simple. It was because the efficiency of this kind of demand and conversion was really not high. In the past, when all living beings were united as one, because there were no direct conflicts or conflicts of interest between them, they would cooperate with one another and put all their efforts into the same direction. This would naturally make the entire extraction process extremely smooth. It was almost as if it had integrated into the life activities of those living beings. In this way, it was naturally difficult to discover the trend of the development of the essence of life without anyone noticing. But now, as the many living beings fell into civil strife, as they held each other back, destroyed each other's plans, and revealed each other's secrets, the various actions that were originally hidden in the spreading activities of the living beings were naturally exposed. As their civil strife developed more and more intense, the consumption and losses of the entire race became greater and greater. The living beings that were originally spread out on most of the roads in the transportation network layer began to rapidly decrease during this process. Even many of the living beings' strongholds or bases that had been established were gradually being reclaimed by the transportation network layer, and they had returned to their original nature. Of course, that was only the nature of it. After all, it had already been modified by those living beings, leaving a certain amount of ruins behind. It was impossible to restore it to its original state, or, at the very least, it was impossible for it to change naturally. At this moment, the heavens-will incarnation in the various worlds also continued to change its methods, using all sorts of strange methods to help the world overcome the world's great tribulation. This situation was as if it was avoiding something. In fact, the heavens-will incarnation's actions were indeed avoiding something. However, what it was avoiding was not a true physical existence. Instead, it was avoiding the level tribulation. The level tribulation was a type of tribulation that was above the world's great tribulation. This type of tribulation used the world's great tribulation as the basic unit, or rather, it used the world's great tribulation as the node. Under such circumstances, it could be said that the worlds within the range of the level tribulation would naturally become the source of the level tribulation's power. In other words, it was the source of the transformation of power. In this way, as long as the heavens-will incarnation did not disappear and did not leave the world that had been integrated into its own system, it would not be able to completely break free from the level tribulation. In other words, even if the incarnation of the heavenly axiom managed to escape the control of the plane calamity by changing its behavior and escape the fate of destroying the entire transportation network, it would only be temporary. For the level tribulation, breaking free was like a rock bouncing on water. Although it looked very arrogant and elegant, it still had to return to the water in the end and return to the control of the level tribulation. If the incarnation of the heavenly way only completed this part of the transformation and then relaxed, then the heavenly tribulation would soon adapt to the incarnation of the heavenly way. It would once again integrate the incarnation of the heavenly way into its own power, so that it could once again contribute to the destruction of the transportation network by the heavenly tribulation. After receiving guidance from Luo Fan, the heavens-will incarnation was very clear about this. Therefore, at this moment, the heavens-will incarnation did not calm down for even a moment. Every change was effective. After the level tribulation could no longer exert its power on itself, it quickly began another change process, and the way it dealt with the world's great tribulation also changed, just like that. Time and time again, the situation of the world changed again and again. At this moment, The entire world was enveloped by the strange brilliance that seemed terrifying but actually didn't pose much of a threat. In the next moment, the entire world seemed to have turned into sound waves and was undergoing some kind of unbelievable distortion. In the next moment, an unknown number of living beings suddenly turned into ghosts and began to attack their friends and companions on a different level. Chapter 2774. The entire transportation network layer fell into endless chaos in the blink of an eye. Many of the world founders had their own thoughts and ways to deal with it. If it was before, they might have discussed things rationally and cautiously so that they could interfere with each other as little as possible so that they would not drag each other down. However, this was clearly something that would only happen under normal circumstances. What was happening in the transportation network layer was clearly not normal. Here, it was a tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer. In such a tribulation, things that were clearly beneficial to the world founders might not necessarily satisfy the requirements of the tribulation. Therefore, under the indescribable manipulation of the tribulation, the world founders' actions became like this. Their methods influenced and interfered with each other, and in the end, they could not achieve their goals. In the end, none of them could truly sever those paths and achieve their goals. On the contrary, the damage to the transportation network layer was getting bigger and bigger as time passed, becoming more and more shocking. At this moment, Luo Fan was paying close attention to all of this, and his expression became solemn. Above the tribulation layer was a world that released endless tribulations. Although it looked rather small from here, in reality, it contained extremely many things, and its structure was indescribably complex. Just by sensing it from afar, Luo Fan could already sense an extremely vast and powerful aura from it. Under this aura, the power of the countless tribulations released from the world seemed to be moving in a seemingly random manner, but it was actually following some indescribable law. The various movements caused the tribulations in the various worlds to change, and the hearts of the founders of the worlds were also vaguely affected. Suddenly, at a certain moment, under all sorts of seemingly coincidental changes that were actually inevitable, the power released by the many founders of the world interweaved with each other and gave birth to boundless vitality. They formed countless living beings that appeared on the roads of the transportation network layer. As soon as these living beings appeared, they began to increase and sublimate at an unimaginable speed. In the beginning, they were extremely weak and could only live and die as they pleased. They could not even gain a foothold in the transportation network layer. However, as time passed and the various changes triggered by the power of the world's founders, the living beings began to strengthen rapidly and gradually gained a foothold on the transportation network layer. Once they gained a foothold, these living beings began to expand outwards. The transportation network layer could accommodate countless worlds. Although many of the paths did not truly follow the principles of space and time, under the senses of living beings, they were definitely larger than all the worlds combined. In such a place, one could imagine how much space there was for these creatures to expand and survive. It could be said that the number of living beings in this world could not even compare to the number of living beings in this world, let alone the fact that these living beings were still extremely rare. Even if all the living beings in the countless worlds were captured and stuffed into the many roads in the transportation network layer, the roads in the transportation network layer would never become crowded. Because they were creatures born in the transportation network layer, they were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. In other words, the living beings that could truly stabilize and gain a foothold in the transportation network layer were naturally very compatible with the transportation network layer. The living beings that did not fit in the transportation network layer had clearly been completely eliminated in the previous birth and death. Under such circumstances, the way these living beings expanded was very different from that of ordinary living beings in the world. They did not want to expand area by area, but they were radiating towards the entire transportation network layer. In other words, they did not start from the beginning and continuously expand in all directions. eventually radiating to the entire transportation network layer. Instead, when it began to expand, a huge number of living beings instantly flew to almost every location in the entire transportation network layer through the special characteristics of the transportation network layer. Then, they established a foothold in that location, multiplied, and finally brought that area under the control of living beings as well. It was as if countless water droplets were sprayed out from the starting point and turned into rain that covered the entire transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, it was naturally impossible for everything to go smoothly. Just the mysteriousness of the transportation network layer itself was enough to pose a great threat to these living beings, causing them to encounter many unexpected environments from time to time. In the end, they would either defeat the environment or be eliminated by the environment. Not to mention, at this time, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were struggling with all their might, wanting to escape from the misfortune and trouble they now knew. In this situation where almost all the worlds were struggling, the chaos in the transportation network layer could be imagined. At this moment, almost every location was filled with incomparably chaotic power, and power was released everywhere, making it difficult to tidy up. Even if real cultivators entered such chaos, it would be difficult for them to survive, let alone these living beings who were only relying on their characteristics as natural living beings to survive in the transportation network layer. If they were really unlucky and encountered a chaotic region, it would be almost fatal for them. It was precisely because of this that the development speed of the living beings in the transportation network layer was restrained to a certain extent. Moreover, even those areas that developed smoothly could not maintain true peace for a long time. Perhaps at this moment, everything was still stable and the world was beautiful. But in the next moment, the world might collapse and everything they were familiar with would completely collapse and disappear. However, since living beings had already been born, it was naturally impossible for them to stop developing. This was especially true for these living beings that were born from the transportation network layer. The birth of these living beings was obviously not really a coincidence, but a random result. Their birth was definitely the result of this so-called layer tribulation. And this tribulation clearly did not create these living beings just to fill up the empty roads in the transportation network layer. Although Luo Fan could not truly understand the meaning of the birth of these living beings, he understood that they must have their own goals, and it could even be said that they had their own conspiracies. If he did not pay attention to them, these living beings would definitely bring great damage to the transportation network layer one day. What a wonderful tribulation! After looking at the situation in the transportation network layer for a while, Luo Fan shifted his attention to his body and mind. Don't forget, a part of that tribulation had clearly penetrated the world of laws and even his body. If he did not pay attention to it, who knew when that part of the tribulation that had penetrated the world would erupt with some power that he did not want to see, creating an outcome that he did not want to see. With a shout in his heart, Luo Fan's world of laws began to surge, quickly cleansing his body and mind, using an incomparably meticulous method to clean up the traces that existed inside and outside of his body and mind that had been penetrated by the tribulation's power. These traces were extremely obscure, and if he did not clearly know that the power had already penetrated his body, he might not have even discovered the existence of these traces. However, compared to other incomparably stubborn influences, the influence of these powers was much smaller. When he discovered the might of the tribulation, it was actually easily stripped away by her. Bit by bit, it was expelled out of his body and mind, and even further out of his world of laws. The whole process was indescribably smooth. It felt like a drop of oil had been dripped on a piece of plastic wrap. With just a light wipe, the drop of oil had been completely wiped away. It seemed that the power of the tribulation could not truly integrate with the world of laws in him. Could it be because I have passed the third great tribulation? Feeling that the infiltration had been easily resolved, Luo Fan could not help but be secretly surprised. At this time, he vaguely understood what would happen when the plain tribulation appeared in the true state of chaos. Perhaps, at that time, the plain tribulation was nothing more than a show for the great heaven and earth. There were no tribulations in the world of laws, and the tribulation might be able to enter the world of laws because of the connection between the world of laws and the chaotic layer it was in. However, it would definitely not be able to truly shake the foundation of the world of laws, and it would definitely not be able to truly destroy the world of laws. If the ruler of the world of laws was willing to cooperate, the tribulation would naturally be able to receive some support from here, allowing the chaotic layer to be tested, tempered, and even obtain opportunities. However, if the world of laws was unwilling, then no matter how hard the tribulation tried, it would only be a problem that could be solved with a single thought. Of course, this was only his guess at this time. It was also a guess that he had made based on the situation of the world of laws at this time, as well as his own situation. It might be true, or it might be false. There might be some subtle differences, or it might be the complete opposite. As for the specifics, he could only be sure when he really reached that level in the future and encountered such a real tribulation. Following this feeling, Luo Fan instantly came to a realization. He must not directly interfere with the tribulation of the transportation network layer this time. If he interfered directly, this level of tribulation would definitely seep into his world of laws and affect his body. If he did not directly interfere, then no matter how the tribulation changed, even if the entire transportation network layer was completely destroyed, it would not affect him at all. At most, he would just lose the transportation network layer. Of course, for Luo Fan, this was because Luo Fan's world of laws had already passed through 3 great tribulations, and it had just passed through the 3rd great tribulation. Because he had just passed the tribulation, the world of laws wouldn't care about him for the time being. Although it would not be as exaggerated as ignoring him, it would definitely not deliberately target him. Of course, this was only the case for Luo Fan. For the other worlds, the situation was obviously different. For the other worlds in the transportation network layer, the tribulation at this time was their test of life and death. If they could pass through it, then not only would they be able to integrate more closely with the transportation network layer, but they could even obtain a certain level of authority in the transportation network layer. Even their own worlds would be able to pass through the great tribulation that they were currently encountering. Because of this, of course, if they could not pass through it, not only would they lose the connection brought about by the transportation network layer, but even their own worlds might be destroyed because of this failure. The reason for this was that they were already a part of this tribulation, and it could even be said that they were the foundation of this tribulation. Once the tribulation succeeded, then their worlds would have to bear all the damage suffered by the transportation network layer at the same time. And once the tribulation failed, the tribulation that they encountered would also fail along with the tribulation. For them, the failure of the tribulation that their own worlds encountered would naturally mean that their own worlds had succeeded. Of course, for the many world founders, if they wanted to help the transportation network layer resist the tribulation, what they could do was very simple, and that was to refocus their attention on their own worlds and help them pass through the tribulation that their own worlds encountered as soon as possible. As mentioned before, the tribulation that their worlds encountered was a component of this tribulation. In this way, the great tribulation of their own worlds would naturally be a component that resisted the tribulation of the entire level. For this level's tribulation, this kind of resistance would naturally directly target the foundation. It went without saying how great the impact and effect would be. Of course, if there was really a world founder that was powerful enough to directly target the tribulation that the entire transportation network layer encountered and directly set off from the many paths in the transportation network layer and set off from the macroscopic region of the entire chaotic layer created by the transportation network layer to resist the tribulation, the effect would naturally not be bad. However, it was obvious that apart from Luo Fan, none of the other world founders in the transportation network layer had such an ability. However, it's not that there's no way. At this moment, Luo Fan suddenly began to rejoice over the various agreements that he had made with the other world founders. Chapter 2776. Of course, The heavenly Tao incarnation was ultimately helping the world resist the world's great tribulation. Therefore, even though the situation of the world seemed rather tragic, the overall development trend of the world was still in the direction of overcoming the world's great tribulation. Naturally, there was more than one kind of change in the level tribulation. The level tribulation was a step further than the other world's great tribulations, so its changes were naturally more subtle and mysterious than the world's great tribulations. After discovering that its control over the world's tribulations had been blocked, the level tribulation gave rise to all kinds of mysterious changes that appeared on the many paths in the transportation network layer. Layers of space-time were born, and time even began to condense and take form. It seemed like the path was about to form a world. The many living beings that had fallen into internal strife on the path were affected by the changing space-time and were all sucked into it. As they were sucked into the space-time, the status and opportunities that they were fighting for naturally lost their original meaning. Although it wasn't completely meaningless, it wasn't as serious as before. In addition, the changes in the space-time were subtle and strange. Even Luo Fan didn't quite understand what the various things were, let alone the living beings. At this time, it was extremely difficult for the living beings that were sucked into the strange space-time to find each other, let alone continue fighting. Since they were no longer fighting, they naturally began to turn their attention to the outside world. Before they were sucked into the strange space-time, the target of these living beings was naturally the transportation network layer. But now, after being sucked into the strange space-time, they could only focus on the strange space-time. The existence of these space-time was due to the power of the level tribulation and the characteristics of the transportation network layer. Under such circumstances, the changes in the space-time would naturally be reflected in the transportation network layer. As the many living beings began to work together again, their original work gradually shifted to the space-time. In other words, the space-time began to gradually transform the roads in the transportation network layer into their own growth resources. They constantly absorbed the various characteristics, powers, and even more indescribable and mysterious existences of those roads, and this was only one of them. Apart from this, there were many other mysterious changes that existed in the plane tribulation. For example, the types of tribulations that ordinary living beings knew of, like the strikes of heavenly lightning, the scorching of heavenly flames, the blowing of cold winds, and so on and so forth. There were all sorts of types, and there were so many of them that it was practically impossible to imagine. At this point, even the stupidest person could see that the transportation network layer was facing a calamity. It was a tribulation similar to the great tribulation of the world. What tribulation is this? Why would it target the transportation network layer? The creators of the world who were still rational were dumbfounded as they looked at the changes in the path outside their world. The shock in their hearts was beyond words. If this tribulation were to appear in my world, some of the founders were even more shocked by the power of this tribulation. The effect of this level of tribulation was far beyond their imagination. If they could gather this power in their own world, they would be able to find their way out in the next instant. As the shock spread, many of the pioneers who had lost their rationality due to anger and indignation finally came to their senses and realized the abnormality of their behavior. As the founders of the world, who already knew about the existence of the great tribulation of the world, how could they not know about the various possibilities of the tribulation? Combining the various possibilities of the Great Tribulation and their previous behavior, how could they not understand that they had been controlled by the tribulation and had become the carrier of the tribulation's power? In an instant, their displeasure, anger, and indignation towards Luo Fan began to weaken. Of course, it was impossible for them to disappear. Although their previous behavior and emotions were affected by the tribulation's power, there was no doubt that Luo Fan's laws of the world were affecting their world and shackling their minds. Obviously, for these founders of the world, if such a situation existed, it was impossible for them to have no grudges against Luo Fan. Their emotions obviously had a great impact on the tribulation. Due to their behavior, the tribulation began to give rise to various other changes. The originally strange and inexplicable space became even stranger and more mysterious at this moment. The attacks, which were already bizarre and direct, became even more bizarre. It felt like the awakening, anger, and displeasure of the world founders were also under the control of the tribulation and were also a part of it. This time, not all the world founders who had awakened could see this clearly. Most of the world founders who had awakened and could barely suppress their displeasure towards Luo Fan and their resentment towards the laws of the world felt inexplicably excited at this moment. They felt like they had finally broken free from their confinement and returned to nature. However, they didn't know that their mentality might also be under the control of some external force. Luo Fan couldn't directly resist the tribulation at this time, so he could only achieve his goal in a roundabout way. Therefore, it was naturally better to take action directly. At this time, he could only use the Heaven Tao incarnation as a medium and use it to manipulate the power of the world to indirectly influence the tribulation. Compared to the creators of the world, who were influenced and manipulated by the layer tribulation, the incarnation of the heavenly way did not have such a drawback. The Heaven Tao incarnation itself was under the complete control of Luo Fan. On the other hand, because Luo Fan's world of laws had just passed the third great tribulation of the world, he was invulnerable to all tribulations for a short period of time. Therefore, this tribulation could only slide through the world of laws, but it couldn't really be controlled by the tribulation. Therefore, Luo Fan's Li Ji naturally couldn't be affected and controlled by the tribulation. Since he couldn't, the Heaven Tao incarnation under his complete control naturally wouldn't be affected either. Therefore, at this time, the only thing that could participate in resisting this tribulation in the entire transportation network layer was the Heaven Tao incarnation of the world of laws. This situation was already much better than the situation of the true chaotic layer. For the true chaotic layer, once it encountered a tribulation, it could only rely on the nature and degree of the chaotic layer to resist it. It was impossible for the great world to participate. Unless it had just passed the great tribulation of the world, it could only become a node of the tribulation. Everything in it would become the target of the tribulation, and its power would become a part of the tribulation's power to destroy the chaotic layer. As for the world that had just passed the great tribulation, they could only watch helplessly like the great world. After all, if it were a truly perfect world, how could it hand over the authority of its own world to the Heaven Tao incarnation of a foreign world like the other worlds in the transportation network layer? It could be said that the possibility of the transportation network layer surviving the tribulation was much higher than that of the true chaotic layer. Sensing that the tribulation of the world that many worlds encountered was constantly catching up with their own changes, the Heaven Tao incarnation gradually stabilized its own rhythm of change, allowing the worlds to gradually fall into a stable state. A stable state that could be sustained, stable, and wouldn't change too much in a short period of time. In this stable state, the Heaven Tao incarnation no longer needed to focus all its attention on the world, nor did it need to wholeheartedly help the world resist the great tribulation. After all, compared to before, the requirements for the Heaven Tao incarnation to resist the tribulation were much lower now. Since the requirements were much lower, it naturally didn't need to expend too much energy and effort, and it was naturally able to divert more attention to other things. The Heaven Tao incarnation itself also had the authority to manipulate the many roads in the transportation network layer. After all, it was a Heaven Tao incarnation that Luo Fan had specially created for the purpose of trading with the other creators of the world. If it wasn't given the authority to manipulate the roads, the Heaven Tao incarnation might be at a disadvantage at any time due to not being able to manipulate the roads. In serious cases, it might even cause the transaction to fail. This possibility wasn't too great, but it was still there. In any case, it wasn't difficult for Luo Fan to give the Heaven Tao incarnation the authority to manipulate the roads in the transportation network layer. In fact, it didn't even require much of his power. Since that was the case, it was naturally most appropriate to directly give them this authority. Because of this decision, the incarnation of the heavenly axiom now had more possibilities in the face of the level tribulation. The heavens-will incarnation did not have much power, at least compared to the level of the creator of the world and the simulated chaos layer in the state of chaos. The heavens-will incarnation's power was definitely insignificant. With such an insignificant amount of power, it was like trying to directly control and fight against the level disaster. It was like trying to pour a cup of water on a burning cart of firewood. It was impossible to achieve his goal. However, these Heavens Tao avatars all possess the authority to control the world, borrow the power of the world, and use the power of the world. With such authority, these heavenly axioms could be said to be the embodiment of a part of the world. Although, compared to the entire transportation network layer, one side of the world was not considered much. After all, it was already on the same level, above the same level. If they wanted to use the world as a foundation to change the entire transportation network layer and resist the power of the tribulations that wreak havoc in the transportation network layer, it had already become possible from the original impossible. Of course, at this moment, when the level disaster and the roads beyond the world were wreaking havoc, the roads in the transportation network layer could almost be said to exist in name only. Wanting to extend the power of the world, or in other words, wanting to extend the power of the world that was not under the control of the level disaster beyond the world was unimaginably difficult. At the very least, it was more than 100 times more difficult than before. Under such circumstances, even the world that was the fastest took hundreds of years to truly control the power of the world beyond the world and began to truly seep into the roads. It began to collide with the power of the many tribulations that existed on the roads. As the first wisp of the power of the world collided with the power of the tribulations, a strange change began to occur. The originally chaotic transportation network layer seemed to have been enraged at this moment, and it began to erupt with terrifying attacks that were many times more powerful than before. Countless unimaginable changes appeared on those paths even faster. All sorts of unimaginable and terrifying creatures were born in the various space-time spaces. Even the space-time spaces began to unite, resulting in earth-shattering changes. Endless power connected with each other, turning into all sorts of indescribable brilliance that converged at the point where the power came into contact, or rather, at the point where the power came into contact. Damn it! The creator of the world could not help but scream at this moment. The impact of this collision on his world was unimaginably great. The one that collided was the power or might of his heaven and earth, and this power or might was clearly drawn from everywhere in this world, so it naturally connected with everything in this world. If it was an ordinary shock or impact, it naturally would not affect the world. However, at this moment, the power of the level disaster was completely different. The power of the level disaster itself was made up of the level disaster that the various worlds encountered as nodes and units. This world was naturally a part of the power of the level disaster, a part of the node. Under such circumstances, the collision between the power of the level disaster and the power of the world was equivalent to a person's two hands colliding. Under such circumstances, it could be said that no matter which side the impact was aimed at, it would eventually converge on this side of the world and naturally manifest itself in this side of the world. Chapter 2777. The heavenly will incarnation didn't pay any attention to the changes in the world. At this time, he was just taking advantage of this opportunity to control the power and might of heaven and earth that he could control. Even if he had to bear the backlash of the heavenly tribulation, he still continued to work tirelessly. Because of the heavenly will incarnation's actions, the backlash of the tribulation naturally grew stronger and stronger. The damage to the world grew stronger and stronger from the backlash. It could be said that if it wasn't for the heavenly axiom incarnation support, the backlash from the world itself and the creator of the world itself would have been enough to completely destroy the world from the very beginning. In another world, the creator personally came to see the heavenly will incarnation and asked with a cold expression, "Did you do this for today?" Although the heavenly will incarnation had fused with the world, he was still an outsider after all. No matter how ingenious the fusion was, it was still easy for the Creator to distinguish him. Of course not. You are not worthy of our schemes, the heavenly will incarnation said coldly. The Creator's expression turned even uglier when he heard that. Although he was unwilling to admit it, he also knew that the gap between him and the Creator of the world was extremely huge. No one would think that it was an exaggeration to say that he was just an ant before the Creator. Since that's the case, then return the world to me. The Creator suppressed the humiliation in his heart and said to the heavenly will incarnation. In fact, if he could do that, the Creator definitely wouldn't care about the heavenly will incarnation or the deal he made with Luo Fan. However, he couldn't do anything about it. From a moment he handed the authority over the world to the heavenly will incarnation, the heavenly will incarnation had already become inseparable from the world. Although the Creator could still discover the existence of the heavenly will incarnation and even see it with his own eyes. However, if he wanted to expel it and take back the authority that was given to the heavenly will incarnation, it would be up to the heavenly will incarnation. Because of this, he could only ask the heavenly will incarnation. A deal is a deal, the heavenly will incarnation said indifferently. To the heavenly will incarnation, Luo Fan's orders were absolute, and it was obvious that Luo Fan's previous attitude was extremely clear. Hand over the authority of this world? This was simply a joke. He did not try to seize more authority, but directly seized all of the authority of the Creator of the world. This was already a very good deal. This is my world, the heaven and earth founder said angrily. At this moment, the aura on his body surged, and the entire world began to shake. It was as if endless dark clouds had appeared in every corner of the sky, and the rumbling of thunder shook the world. If it wasn't for the fact that the entire world was on the verge of collapse and destruction, just this change alone would be enough to make everyone doubt if the world was going to be destroyed. This is still your heaven and earth. We did not snatch away your heaven and earth. The incarnation of the heavens will replied indifferently. Since you've admitted that this is my world, then I don't welcome you. Get out of here right now. The heaven and earth Creator roared with a sinister expression. A deal is a deal. If this deal isn't completed, then nothing will develop according to your preferences, the clone said without any change in his expression. Deal. You were originally a resource that I obtained here. Now that I don't want this resource anymore, of course I have the right to make you scram. Don't you abide by the rules of the deal? Then scram right now according to the rules of the deal. The expression of the heaven and earth founder became even more sinister. At this moment, the dark clouds in the sky became even denser, and the rumbling of thunder became even more terrifying. However, these changes did not affect the living beings in the world as much as they imagined. The reason was very simple. Compared to the various tribulations that were occurring in the world at all times, this scene of dark clouds covering the sky and rumbling thunder was nothing at all. Their shock and astonishment had long since become numb from the various tribulations that had occurred in the past few days. Apologies, but that's impossible. This is your rule of the deal, not mine. The clone only said this, and his expression did not change at all. It was even more impossible for him to let go of the world before him. The heaven and earth founder roared furiously. He could no longer hold back his anger and directly attacked the clone. For a moment, the heavenly Tao incarnation felt the entire world begin to struggle. Endless power began to gather towards him from all directions. The part of him that had fused with the world began to tremble, and there was an inconceivable resistance pushing against those parts, trying to forcibly separate him from his fusion with the world. At the same time, an unimaginable and terrifying power crushed the clone's body from all directions, or rather, the body that had appeared before the heaven and earth founder. The heavenly Tao incarnation only sneered in the face of such a change. The various powers and energies were instantly transferred and turned into a force that pushed outwards towards the tribulation beyond the heavens and earth. Asterisk crack, crack, crack. Asterisk, the terrifying sound clearly came from outside the world, and all living beings in the world, including the heaven and earth founder, could clearly hear it. "Don't you feel it? Your emotions are a little abnormal," the clone said to the heaven and earth founder after doing all that. Hearing this, the heaven and earth founder shuddered, as if he had come to a realization. However, his emotions were soon filled with rage and irritation again. He sneered, "Are you going to say that I've been controlled by the tribulation? I've long since known that this was a possibility. But so what? Regardless of whether I've been controlled or not, that's what I think in my heart. Moreover, this is a thought that I've suppressed in my heart for who knows how many years. Now that I've taken this opportunity to erupt, it suits me perfectly." Hearing this, the clone fell into deep thought. It was clear that the heaven and earth founder's thoughts were quite unexpected to him. It must be said that normally, the heaven and earth founder placed great importance on his own will. Even if it wasn't as absolute as Luo Fan, even if there were any traces of manipulation and influence, it still wasn't to the extent that he knew that he was being manipulated by force, or even to the extent that he wasn't moved at all. However, the behavior of the heaven and earth founder had completely overturned this concept and completely violated this principle. He knew that he was being manipulated, but he didn't care at all. There was clearly something wrong with this situation. However, the heaven and earth founder did not feel anything at all. He completely treated all of this as his true thoughts and attitude. This was strange no matter how one looked at it. There was no need to think too much about the source of all of this. Apart from the tribulation, what else could it be? In other words, the fact that this being did not care about his own well-being affected was clearly because of the tribulation's influence. It was the power of the tribulation that changed his thoughts and emotions, ultimately creating a heaven and earth founder that was completely an enemy of the clone of the heaven and earth. Although the heaven and earth founder could not directly expel the clone of the heaven and earth and prevent it from controlling the power and might of the heaven and earth, it was not as if the heaven and earth founder's actions were completely ineffective. In reality, because of the heaven and earth founder's actions, many of the clone of the heaven and earth founder's plans to deal with the tribulation could not be carried out at all. All of the plans fell short in the end, and in the end, the clone of the heaven and earth founder could not achieve what he wanted. Usually, this failure to achieve the goal meant that the heaven and earth's resistance to the tribulation did not achieve the desired effect. In this case, the heaven and earth founder's resistance to the clone of the heaven and earth caused the situation of the heaven and earth to rapidly deteriorate. Laws, paths, time, space, matter, energy, everything was heading towards the abyss of collapse and destruction at an unimaginable speed. A feeling of despair began to gradually spread throughout this part of the world. Originally, although the situation of the heaven and earth seemed extremely terrible, as if it was in the midst of endless tribulations that could not be transcended and could not be stabilized at any time, the overall situation was still within an acceptable range. Although the situation seemed extremely terrible, it also contained the existence of the same level of hope, so the living beings did not truly feel despair. But now, as that hope gradually became powerless, despair gradually began to swell. In the end, the endless feelings of despair began to rapidly expand and gradually turned into the mainstream of the heaven and earth. Gradually, it began to affect many aspects of the heaven and earth, and even began to turn into the power of the tribulation, causing the tribulation to continuously strengthen and expand. This situation was clearly an accident. At the very least, it was an accident for Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan quickly learned of this change through the clone of the heaven and earth. He could not help but feel a little helpless. Indeed, it's impossible for everything to develop in the most perfect way that I expected. Although he knew of this accident, Luo Fan could not help the clone of the heaven and earth at all. After all, at this moment his world of laws, or rather, his main body, could not participate in the resistance against the tribulation at all. Under such circumstances, although he wanted to help the incarnation of the heavenly way in that part of the world, and help it suppress the creator of the world, he could only guide the incarnation from afar. He could not directly take action or use external force to help the incarnation of the heavenly way. As for the significance of giving pointers to the clone of the heaven and earth, if it were in the past when the clone of the heaven and earth wasn't familiar with resisting the tribulation, the effect would naturally be rather obvious. However, at this moment, when the clone of the heaven and earth was even more familiar with the tribulation than Luo Fan himself and had more experience with it, the situation was obviously completely different. At this moment, Luo Fan's guidance to the clone of the heaven and earth was actually unable to surpass the actions of the clone of the heaven and earth itself. In other words, even if the clone of the heaven and earth followed Luo Fan's guidance, it would not be of any help to the situation that the clone of the heaven and earth was encountering. The heaven and earth would still be the same. Moreover, it was not just one heaven and earth that were experiencing changes at this time. More and more heaven and earth were falling into the same trouble. Luo Fan could give pointers to 1, or even 10, or even 100, 1,000, or even 10,000 heaven and earth, but the number of heaven and earth that had problems was calculated in the millions. These millions of heaven and earth were essentially the same, but their behavior was completely different. Under such circumstances, if Luo Fan wanted to give pointers to them, it was obviously impossible for him to directly follow a template. If he wanted to achieve the goal he wanted, he could only honestly follow the instructions of the heaven and earth and design the methods of the heaven and earth. It would not have much effect, and instead he would have to waste millions of processes to design, think, and give pointers. How could Luo Fan do something that did not make up for the losses? Since that's the case, let's see who's faster. In the end, Luo Fan made this decision. With this decision, he no longer cared about what happened to the heavens and earth. Instead, he watched as the heavenly way incarnation sped up and guided the power of the heavens and earth into the paths of the transportation network layer to resist the power of the tribulation layer. More and more creators of the heaven and earth shed all pretenses of cordiality with the clone of the heaven and earth and began to take action against the clone of the heaven and earth. They either used the power of the heaven and earth to suppress the clone of the heaven and earth, or directly attack the clone of the heaven and earth with their own power. The various changes were also vaguely strengthening the power of the tribulation on the path outside the heaven and earth. As the power continued to strengthen, the pressure on the power and power drawn from the heaven and earth became stronger and stronger. However, compared to the power and power of the heaven and earth, which was controlled and guided by the clone of the heaven and earth, the power of the tribulation completely relied on its own nature. In terms of technique, the two were completely different. In this way, the power and power drawn from the heaven and earth had a chance to resist under the pressure of the stronger tribulation, or rather, a chance to win. Chapter 2778. The might and power that flowed out of the world contained the will of the heavenly axioms incarnation, and the changes were also rather rich and mysterious. When the two of them fought, what emerged in the end was an indescribable and mysterious battle scene. For a time, the roads in the transportation network layer surged like a storm, almost turning into an encyclopedia of tribulations, allowing any creator of the world to see the tribulations that their world had encountered or even just imagined. This scene was naturally not attractive to the world founders who were fighting against the heavenly axioms incarnation and trying to expel it from their world so that their world would no longer be a battlefield for the battle between the heavenly axioms incarnation and the level tribulations. However, for the world founders who were not hysterical to this extent, this scene had almost overturned their worldview. It made them feel that their understanding of the simulated state of chaos, the world, and the tribulations was no longer the same as before. Could it be that in the eyes of chaos, the chaos layer is essentially no different from the world? This was what some world founders thought. With this thought, they felt that their understanding of the state of chaos seemed to be shrouded in a new layer of fog. It also felt like some kind of truth had been revealed to them, but it felt extremely complicated and indescribable. The changes in this stage of the level tribulations lasted for more than 2,000 years in the transportation network layer. Over the past 2,000 years, the flow of time in many worlds was different. So the flow of time in almost every world did not match the flow of time in the past 2,000 years. Among them, the worlds with the fastest flow of time had already experienced close to 200,000 years. On the other hand, the worlds with the shortest flow of time had only experienced a few hundred years. However, whether it was the worlds with the longest flow of time or the shortest flow of time, after experiencing the changes in time, their fusion with the level tribulations had all taken a step forward. Whether it was the worlds that wanted to fight against the heavenly axiom's incarnation and expel it, or the worlds that did not do so at all and only passively endured the impact of the level tribulations, it was the same. Under this combination, those heavens and earth were in a state where they were on the verge of collapse. It was as if it was going to collapse completely in the next moment. The entire world, along with the creator of the world, was going to perish together. However, at this moment, a trace of vitality appeared out of nowhere and pulled the world slightly, allowing it to escape the abyss of destruction. Then it was pushed back toward the abyss again, and so on, the cycle repeated. It wasn't just one side of the world that was like this, but almost all the worlds in the transportation network layer were the same. Regardless of whether it was a world with a heavenly Tao incarnation or a world without a heavenly Tao incarnation, there was no exception. The entire transportation network layer seemed to have reached the critical point of destruction. The entire simulated chaotic layer seemed to be on the verge of complete destruction in the next instant. It should be starting soon. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the world of laws, thought to himself. At this point, they had actually reached a critical juncture of the plane calamity. Next, there would definitely be new changes to this tribulation. If these changes were to succeed, then the entire transportation network layer would collapse completely. Once this happened, his world of laws might still be able to exist and not be destroyed by the plane calamity. However, from now on, he would no longer be able to rebuild the transportation network layer. Any actions that could have easily formed the transportation network layer would no longer be effective. Luo Fan naturally couldn't accept this result. Although he couldn't directly resist the plane calamity, the heavenly Tao incarnation that was deeply involved in the plane calamity was still under his control. Through the heavenly Tao incarnation, he could also transform his will into power to resist the plane calamity. At this moment, the heavenly Tao incarnation that was scattered all over the world suddenly received Luo Fan's will and instantly took action. The incarnation of the will of heaven, which had been forced to retreat under the attack of the creator of the universe and could only passively defend, suddenly flipped over and instantly took complete control of the entire world, directly weakening all the authority of the creator of the universe to the point where it almost completely disappeared. How is this possible? Exclamations of disbelief rang out from all over the world. At this moment, the plane calamity that was brewing a new round of changes paused slightly. As mentioned before, the plane calamity was based on the tribulations that the world had encountered as its basic unit. Moreover, because of the development over the past 2,000 years, the world creators had also been infected by the plane calamity and had become a part of it. Under such circumstances, any changes that occurred to the world creators or the world creators would obviously trigger a chain reaction that would ultimately be reflected in the plane calamity's performance. At this moment, what the heavenly Tao incarnation was doing was directly cutting off the world creator's control over the world. Since the world creator and the world had become an important part of the plane calamity, this was equivalent to forcibly cutting off a large portion of the plane calamity's power. As such, it couldn't be more normal for such an obvious effect to occur. It was like a crane that was moving something heavy to a critical location. Suddenly, the power of the crane was removed. The result was obvious. At this moment, the plane calamity was experiencing a similar situation. Although the power of the plane calamity wasn't completely removed or erased, it had already affected a large portion of the plane calamity's foundation. How could the plane calamity not show any reaction when it had already affected a large portion of the plane calamity's foundation? The many components of the plane calamity were closely related and could even be said to be an inseparable whole. At this moment, when one part of the plane calamity had a problem, the impact naturally spread to all parts of the plane calamity. This included the places that weren't directly connected to the world creators and the many places in the depths of the paths. For a time, the entire transportation network of the plane calamity collapsed at an alarming rate. The plane calamity that had already gained the upper hand and was preparing for the final blow suddenly became chaotic. The powers of the various plane calamities clashed with each other, causing internal strife that shouldn't have appeared. This rare opportunity was tightly grasped by the heavenly Tao incarnation. It had to be known that although the heavenly Tao incarnations were scattered across many worlds and seemed to be separated from each other by a world, in reality, the heavenly Tao incarnations were still the heavenly Taos of the world of laws. Therefore, no matter how far apart they were, no matter how many worlds they were separated from each other, the connection between them would never be severed. In this way, the many heavenly Tao incarnations could almost be regarded as one. Under such circumstances, the heavenly Tao incarnations each controlled almost all the authority of their respective worlds and grasped almost all the power and might of their respective worlds. Thus, they had almost become existences of the same nature as the plane calamity. Don't forget that the plane calamity itself used the various plane calamities of the world as its basic unit. In other words, it was essentially an aggregation. At this moment, after the many heavenly Tao incarnations controlled almost all the authority of the various worlds, they had obviously also turned into aggregations of similar nature. I've finally succeeded. My acting for so long wasn't in vain. At this moment, Luo Fan, who was in the world of laws, finally relaxed completely. At this stage, it could be said that he had truly grasped the strength to resist the plane calamity. Clearly, only the power of the heavenly Tao incarnations could resist the plane calamity. If it was just the heavenly Tao incarnations, it clearly couldn't compare to the plane calamity. It was naturally a pipe dream to think that the heavenly Tao incarnations could resist the plane calamity with their own power. Before this, although the heavenly Tao incarnations had already grasped a portion of the authority of those worlds, that authority was fundamentally only bestowed by the creator of that world. Although the heavenly Tao incarnations relied on their own understanding of the world and the plane calamity to deepen and expand this authority to the point that even the creator of that world couldn't take it away at will. However, this essence that was bestowed by the creator of that world couldn't be changed no matter what. If the creator of that world really wanted to go against the creator of that world, it would definitely cause a great impact on the creator of that world. Perhaps it wouldn't be able to directly deprive the heavenly Tao incarnations of their authority, but it would definitely be enough to prevent the heavenly Tao incarnations of their authority to the peak. If they were to resist the plane calamity in this state, it would be equivalent to fighting with their hands tied. Even if they had a great advantage, it would be difficult for them to win because of this binding. Moreover, even if the heavenly Tao incarnations gathered the power of many worlds, they could only barely compare to the plane calamity. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan, who clearly understood this point, made a plan at that time. A plan to seize the authority of those worlds. As for the process of this plan, it was already clear now. The heavenly Tao incarnations didn't really exert their strength over the past thousands of years. They only retreated along with the attacks of the creators of that world, acting as if they were barely maintaining their authority. They allowed the will of the creators of that world to permeate those worlds and allowed the power of the plane calamity to continuously change those worlds. In the end, after thousands of years of suppression, those worlds reached the critical point of destruction, and the plane calamity reached the critical point of victory. This critical point was extremely important to the plane calamity. After all, only at this critical point could the plane calamity truly win and complete its purpose of being born, which was to completely destroy the transportation network and the countless worlds within it. For the heavenly axiom incarnation, this critical point was equally important, because only by arriving at this critical point would he be able to request the world he resided in to surpass the authority of the creator of the world. That's right, directly apply to the heavens and earth to surpass the authority of its creator. Heaven and earth was an incomparably mysterious existence. Even if it was created by the creator of the world, the moment it was born, it already contained all sorts of mysteries that surpassed the creator of the world. Otherwise, how could the creator of the world rely on the world to survive in this simulated state of chaos? How could he rely on the world to maintain his sense of self in this simulated state of chaos? How could he rely on these heavens and earth to exert power and strength that was countless times stronger than his own? There is obviously only one possibility for all of this, and that was that the world was inherently stronger than the creator of the world after it was born. Since that was the case, then it was clearly impossible for the world to be a mere puppet of the creator of the world. The existence of autonomy would definitely appear in the world. This kind of autonomy might exist in the form of the world's will, or in the form of the world's instinct, or it might just exist in some more subtle and mysterious structure. But no matter what, as long as the world could protect the creator of the world, it would definitely have this kind of autonomy. There was no doubt about this. Normally, with the existence of the creator of the world naturally didn't need to display its autonomy. After all, no matter how strong this kind of autonomy was, it couldn't compare to an existence like the creator of the world in terms of reaction time and speed. In the face of a normal crisis, there was naturally no need for this kind of autonomy to be displayed. It was precisely because of this that the many worlds had always been like puppets of the creator of the world, and they didn't display this kind of autonomy at all. But obviously, this wasn't absolute. The existence of autonomy was already a real fact. It didn't display it originally because there was no need to, not because it couldn't be displayed. Once the world needed to display its autonomy in order to continue existing, the world would definitely not be stingy in displaying its autonomy. At this time, the creator of the world was completely controlled by the level tribulation, and the world was completely under the threat of the basic units of the level tribulation. It was about to reach the critical point of destruction. If the world didn't display its autonomy now, when would it display it? Chapter 2779. The world founders did not understand what was going on at all. To them, the world should belong to them. Everything in the world should develop according to their thoughts and evolve according to their will. The highest authority in the world should also be under their absolute control. But now, his authority was actually suppressed by an outsider. The other party was actually able to directly restrict his authority over the world, turning him into a blind man in this world. This kind of situation was simply as exaggerated as a person suddenly discovering that their body had betrayed them and was no longer listening to their commands. At this moment, the minds of the world founders suddenly became much clearer, and indescribable fear emerged from the bottom of their hearts. He can actually do such an unbelievable thing just by relying on the incarnation of the heaven way. How much stronger is he than us? That was what many of the world founders thought. Perhaps the words used by different world founders would be slightly different. However, the general meaning was similar. The he that they were referring to was naturally Luo Fan, who was still in the world of laws. The incarnation of the heaven way came from the world of laws, and the world of laws was created by Luo Fan. Therefore, all the achievements of the incarnation of the heaven way could be attributed to Luo Fan at the end of the day. At this moment, the incarnation of the heaven way displayed power that was completely incomprehensible and unimaginable. They naturally gave the credit to Luo Fan. It was precisely because they could not understand and imagine how powerful this method was that they understood it even more. At this moment, the fear that they had accumulated for Luo Fan in their hearts had unknowingly resurfaced. At this moment, the incarnation of the heaven way no longer paid attention to the world founders. To them, the current harvest and the highest authority in the world was all that they wanted in the world. Under such circumstances, they naturally no longer needed to continue entangling with the world founders. With this highest authority, their ability to control the world, as well as the efficiency of using the power of the world, was completely incomparable to before. Under such circumstances, they did not even need to do anything. They only needed to make some slight adjustments to the situation of the world, and it would be enough to save the world from the crisis of destruction. An indescribable sense of hope suddenly welled up in the hearts of all the living beings who were awaiting the end of the world. At this moment, a path that led to the heavens suddenly appeared in front of him. It seemed that as long as he stepped on it, he would obtain eternal light and an unlimited future. This kind of feeling was very novel for the beings of this generation. However, if they knew the feelings of their ancestors from countless generations ago, they would realize that this feeling was merely returning at that time, when the incarnation of the heavenly Tao did its best to help this world resist the tribulation of the heavens and the earth. All living beings in this world had such a feeling. Even in the darkest moments of despair, he could feel a glimmer of hope and light in his heart. Of course, it would be easier to understand it in another way. That was the pressure and corrosion that the great tribulation of the heavens and the earth placed on the hearts of all living beings had been isolated by the heaven Tao's transformation into the world. In reality, although the great tribulation of the heavens and the earth did not directly target the living beings in the world with any changes or unimaginable powers, the attacks of the great tribulation of the heavens and the earth were unstoppable. However, the attack of the great tribulation of heaven and earth was unstoppable. As long as there was a loophole in the world, no matter if it was real or spiritual, the tribulation would not let it go. Some loopholes in the hearts of living beings were naturally no exception. Under such circumstances, the living beings in the midst of the tribulations might not feel like they were being attacked directly, but their minds would be gradually infected by the tribulations. They would gradually fall into despair, hysteria, and other negative emotions. Now, what the incarnation of the heavenly Tao was doing was taking over the infection and separating the infection from the hearts of the living beings in the world. The difference between being infected and not being infected manifested boundless light and hope. The situation of the world started to improve under the incarnation's control. The various powers, and traces of destruction that were originally spread all over the world and had almost shaken the foundations of the world were rapidly dispelled during this process. Unknowingly, the living beings in the world felt that the world had returned to peace, and all the destruction caused by the tribulation seemed to have disappeared. Has the great tribulation passed? This thought unknowingly appeared in the hearts of many living beings in the world. As for the overall situation, the macroscopic situation, almost all living beings in the world could not see it clearly. To them, all the changes in the world could only be sensed by the changes in their surroundings. Now, the tribulation around them had unknowingly disappeared, and the destruction caused by the tribulation had also disappeared. To them, this was naturally a sign that the tribulation had passed without them knowing. However, this might not be false to them. With the great tribulation of the heavens and earth controlling and resisting the great tribulation of the heavens and earth, the great tribulation of the heavens and earth had nothing to do with them. From today onwards, they could indeed say that the great tribulation had completely passed for them. As the power of the tribulation was suppressed, the power of the tribulation that was wreaking havoc on the transportation network layer also fell into an increasingly intense state of chaos. The various tribulations started clashing with each other, killing each other, causing all sorts of inconceivable chaos to appear on the paths. The result of all these chaos was usually mutual destruction, and the paths were heavily damaged. Under such circumstances, the roads of the entire transportation network layer were already dead in name only. In the past, when the power of the tribulation worked together to destroy the paths, due to the existence of order, the paths could barely be considered to be connected. In other words, even if the power of the tribulation was especially powerful in many parts and paths, no living being or power could pass through. However, there would definitely be some paths that were easier to pass through and other parts and paths. Under such circumstances, although the state of communication in the transportation network layer was tens of thousands of times worse than before, it could still bear a small part of the functions of the transportation network layer. However, now that the power of the tribulation had fallen into chaos, the order that was originally maintained had completely disappeared. The various changes of the tribulation that were originally condensed began to disperse, and in the end, they spread evenly across the many paths in the transportation network layer. They were extremely uniform, and there were no loopholes at all, blocking all paths. They blocked the goal of all living beings that wanted to use the paths to move between the heavens and earth. Looks like the tribulation this time is no longer a threat. I wonder what kind of reward I'll get for passing the tribulation. Luo Fan thought to himself as he let out a long sigh in the world of laws. The tribulation this time lasted for thousands of years. During such a long time, the various changes in power and attack methods displayed by the tribulation were not inferior to the great tribulations of the heavens and earth that any other world had encountered. In fact, it could almost be considered an encyclopedia of the great tribulations of the heavens and earth that all worlds had encountered. Even Luo Fan, who had been watching the tribulation constantly display its might, constantly transforming its power and constantly improving its means, had unknowingly developed an inexplicable vigilance and worry in his heart. It was because of this wariness and worry that he was certain that the tribulation had finally been passed, and he became more and more relaxed. As for why he said that the tribulation had been passed and that it would not repeat itself, it was even simpler. This was because although the tribulation was condensed from the great tribulations of the heavens and earth that many worlds had encountered, and its foundation was also the great tribulations of the heavens and earth. However, it was still an existence that was completely different from the great tribulations of the heavens and earth. Such an existence naturally had a completely different characteristic from the great tribulations of the heavens and earth. And at this time, Luo Fan's words were obviously completely aimed at this characteristic. This was because the power of the level tribulation was condensed from scattered units, so it was different from the great tribulation of the world. Its structure meant that it needed many foundations to be able to maintain itself. Any change it displayed, any kind of destructive effect, required many conditions to be able to be maintained. After so many years of development, the great tribulations of the heavens and earth had clearly been treated as the true foundation of the tribulation. Almost all the power, changes, and destructive effects of the tribulation originated from the great tribulations of the heavens and earth, and they required the support of the great tribulations of the heavens and earth to be maintained. But now, the great tribulations of the heavens and earth had already been suppressed by the heavenly Tao incarnation, and had been completely assimilated by the heavenly Tao incarnation with the power of the heavens and earth. As a result, although the great tribulations of the heavens and earth still existed, there was no longer any power to support its changes. There was no power to maintain the various powers and effects that the tribulation displayed on the transportation network layer. Those powers and effects had already reached that level. It was like a person had climbed tens of thousands of meters into the sky by relying on stairs. Under such circumstances, suppressing the power of the great tribulations of the heavens and earth was equivalent to removing the stairs out of thin air. As a result, the outcome of the tribulation was self-evident. It could be said that there was no longer a need for Luo Fan to do anything, nor was there a need for the heavenly Tao incarnation to do anything. Just the tribulation itself was already enough to kill it and let everything pass. Although the tribulation didn't have a consciousness, it was clearly an existence similar to the heavens and earth, and it also possessed some sort of instinct. In such a situation, seeing that destruction was right in front of it, it would naturally struggle. This struggle was clearly directed towards the heavenly Tao incarnation in the heavens and earth. For the tribulation, It needed the power of the great tribulations of the heavens and earth to make up for its foundation, and it needed the endless power to maintain the power that it displayed. Only in this way would he be able to struggle out from the brink of destruction. Only by doing this could he prevent himself from dying in the following timeline. In this way, under the influence of the tribulation, the great tribulations of the heavens and earth began to display many changes that shouldn't exist in the great tribulations of the heavens and earth. Those changes that should only appear in the great tribulations of the other heavens and earth. If the heavenly Tao incarnation was scattered and didn't have any connection with the other heavenly Tao incarnations, then these changes would be enough to exhaust the heavenly Tao incarnation. But evidently, the reality wasn't like that. The many heavenly Tao incarnations were connected to each other. All the heavenly Tao incarnations formed a single entity, and it was an existence similar to the tribulation itself. Under such circumstances, the heavenly Tao incarnation was extremely familiar with the power and changes of the tribulations that were completely aimed at the other heavens and earth. It was something that the other parts of the heavenly Tao incarnation had resisted countless times. Under such circumstances, it was naturally easy for the heavenly Tao incarnation to resist. The heavenly Tao incarnation easily suppressed the changing power of the tribulations, allowing the heavens and earth to maintain a stable and calm state. Of course, the changes in the power of the tribulations also resulted in changes in the way the heavens and earth resisted. Although the heavens and earth as a whole remained stable and calm, it was impossible for it to be completely unaffected. In fact, along with the appearance of the changes, all sorts of unimaginable scenes appeared in the heavens and earth. The unimaginable scenes gave everyone the feeling that the rewards of the tribulation had already been given. These scenes were produced by the conflict between the heavens and the tribulations, and they contained the profundities of the heavens and earth and the profundities of the heavens and earth. Chapter 2781. These worlds were obviously not all of the worlds affected by the traffic network layer. The reason why they were connected to the traffic network layer so quickly was that they had already started the connection process before the level disaster descended. It was just that the traffic network layer hadn't been fully accepted by the simulated chaos state, so it didn't have the ability to actively guide the worlds to connect to itself, which was why they didn't complete the entire connection process at the beginning. At this time, as the traffic network layer became more and more stable, the degree of integration with the simulated chaos state became higher and higher, and the number of worlds affected by the simulated chaos state naturally increased. Once the base number increased, the number of individuals that met the conditions naturally increased. Therefore, at this time, the traffic network layer was still constantly squirming and changing its form. At every moment, there would be a certain number of worlds appearing in the traffic network layer, allowing the traffic network layer to expand constantly. Although the extent of expansion wasn't as great as at the beginning, it seemed to be able to continue like this forever. In fact, this might not be an illusion. Given the appearance of the simulated chaos state and the nature of the traffic network layer, the expansion of the traffic network layer might really be able to continue for a very long time. After all, the traffic network layer and the stock market were recognized by the simulated chaos state and truly turned into a natural phenomenon, or in other words, a natural rule. Under such circumstances, as long as the worlds existed in the simulated chaos state, they would naturally form a connection with it and eventually connect to it. How many worlds were there in the simulated chaos state? The number was almost endless. So many of them were adjusting themselves and changing their own worlds at every moment. Who knew when one of the worlds would meet the standard of establishing a connection at the transportation network layer, due to all kinds of adjustments and changes? Once it met this standard, it would naturally be connected to the traffic network layer. In this way, it could be predicted that even if the traffic network layer completely digested the gains from passing the level disaster and no longer expanded its influence range like now, the new worlds that were connected to the traffic network layer wouldn't disappear completely. Perhaps the speed of increase would slow down a lot, but it would definitely continue to exist. And once such a world appeared continuously, it would seem that the transportation network layer would continue to be active and would continue to be so. The change in the traffic network layer was a pleasant surprise for Luo Fan. However, this kind of change could be said to be natural. Layer tribulation was a tribulation that simulated the state of chaos and was triggered by the tribulation layer. It was a type of tribulation that targeted the transportation network layer. If such a tribulation couldn't be overcome, then the transportation network layer would naturally collapse completely, and it would be impossible to leave any traces behind. However, once such a tribulation was passed, it would mean that the transportation network layer's efforts to erase the transportation network layer had failed. The failure of this kind of effort naturally meant that it had to admit the legitimacy of the transportation network layer, and it had to make up for everything that was missing in the original transportation network layer. Therefore, such a change was only natural. How much benefit would such a change bring to Luo Fan? First of all, the most obvious thing was that from now on, he no longer needed to worry about the transportation network layer disappearing. At the very least, he didn't have to worry about this for the time being. Secondly, he was already able to transform the shackles of his world of laws to other worlds into connections at the transportation network level. This transformation didn't change the nature of the shackles, but it made the originally abstract shackles that even he himself couldn't perceive become a concrete, physical connection. Thirdly, his world of laws would receive a powerful support. In the past, Luo Fan used the world of laws to maintain the transportation network layer. If there was a problem with the world of laws, then the transportation network layer would inevitably have problems. The root cause of the many abnormalities and changes that occurred before was this. But now, the situation had been reversed. Now, it was no longer the world of laws that supported the transportation network layer, but the transportation network layer that supported the world of laws. Now, any changes to the world of laws could no longer affect the entire transportation network layer. Even if the world of laws was completely separated from the transportation network layer, the transportation network layer wouldn't collapse as it did before. On the other hand, if there was any external force that attacked the world of laws, then the transportation network layer would become the backing of the world of laws. Perhaps some ordinary attacks wouldn't react to the transportation network layer. However, if there was a truly powerful attack that could threaten the safety of the world of laws, then the transportation network layer would definitely react to prevent the attack from taking effect. And this was only the result without Luo Fan's control. If Luo Fan wanted to, he could even take the initiative to control the support of the transportation network layer and use the power of the countless worlds that existed in the entire transportation network layer to resist those external attacks. These external attacks even included the great tribulation of the world. In other words, even if Luo Fan was as helpless against the great tribulation of the world as the many worlds in the transportation network layer, he could still easily rely on the support of the transportation network layer to survive more great tribulation of the world. I didn't expect there to be such an unexpected gain. Luo Fan thought to himself as he looked up at the tribulation layer that shrouded the entire transportation network layer. Now, the tribulation layer still hadn't dissipated. It was still shrouding the transportation network layer, including the countless worlds that existed within it. This clearly meant that the tribulation hadn't ended just yet. The ease he felt now was only temporary. After a certain period of time, the transportation network layer would definitely welcome another layer tribulation. The many worlds within it would also definitely welcome another great tribulation of the world after a certain period of time. This situation was extremely similar to the state of the world when it encountered a great tribulation of the world. Perhaps the transportation network layer would truly become boundless after passing through several great tribulation of the world. Currently, Luo Fan couldn't do anything about the evolution of the great tribulation of the world of laws. All he could do was accept it and wait. After looking for a while and discovering that there were no changes in the tribulation layer, he focused his attention on the transportation network layer at this moment. Although he had been paying attention to the evolution of the transportation network layer before, He only paid more attention to its surface changes. He didn't pay much attention to the deeper changes. However, it was obvious that the changes in the transportation network layer weren't just limited to the surface. There were so many worlds, and the number of times they had passed through the Great Tribulation of the world was completely different. Some had not passed through any Great Tribulation of the world. Some had passed through one Great Tribulation of the world, and some had passed through two Great Tribulations of the world. How could such worlds coexist evenly with each other? Don't forget that the transportation network layer was also a simulated state of chaos. What was the structure of the world in the simulated state of chaos like? It was a pyramid structure. Under such circumstances, the structure of the worlds in the transportation network layer had to conform to the pyramid structure to be reasonable. Of course, the structure of this pyramid couldn't be as obvious as one would imagine. This pyramid structure would definitely have a transformation that corresponded to the road network in the transportation network layer. Such a structure was actually not difficult to discover. Very quickly, Luo Fan had already discerned what form the various heavens and earths used to construct this pyramid structure. In the transportation network layer, the difference in status between the many worlds was distinguished by the roads. Those worlds that had not passed through any great tribulation of the world all had roads connecting them together. Perhaps not all of them were connected, but there were no real restrictions between them. As long as they were willing, they could directly establish roads to communicate with each other. However, any world that had not passed through any great tribulation of the world could only contact a world that had passed through the first great tribulation of the world. If one wanted to contact another world that had passed through the first great tribulation of the world, they had to first pass through that world as a transit point. It was simply impossible to directly establish a road connection with other worlds that had not passed through any great tribulation of the world, as long as both parties agreed. Similarly, a world that had passed through the first great tribulation of the world could also only establish a connection with a world that had passed through the second great tribulation of the world. Other than being able to directly contact more worlds that had not passed through the first great tribulation of the world, there was not much difference between them and the worlds that had not passed through the first great tribulation of the world. In contrast, the world that had passed through the second great tribulation of the world didn't have such an obvious performance. This was because in the transportation network layer, only the world that had passed through the third great tribulation of the world existed. Therefore, the worlds that had passed through the second great tribulation of the world could at most only establish a connection with the world that had passed through the third great tribulation of the world. As for the restrictions, they could not see it clearly. This kind of structure was very distinct. Not long after Luo Fan saw through it, the other world's founders also saw it one after another. For a time, an inexplicable surprise began to appear in the hearts of many world founders. Through the analysis of this structure, even the world founders who could not see through the overall structure of the entire transportation network layer could quickly determine that the most special world in the transportation network layer was the world of laws, and the most special world founder was Luo Fan. The new world founders had no concept of what Luo Fan had done in the past. After discovering how special Luo Fan was, many people actually came to ask him for advice, or rather, to question him. Luo Fan had no interest in paying attention to the questions of these world founders. He just casually threw out a heavenly Tao incarnation to receive them, and he did not have any intention of spending any effort to socialize with them. Why is there such a structure? The heavenly Tao incarnation looked at the hundreds of world founders and repeated their questions with an extremely cold expression. Then, he just said indifferently, "Haven't you guys noticed that this is the structure of the chaos world? Now, this is just a manifestation of this structure that you guys were originally unable to detect." His words instantly stunned the founders of the world. What does he mean? What did he say? Did I hear wrongly? A world founder murmured, as if he was talking to himself, but also as if he was confirming with his companions. You didn't hear wrongly. He did say that the structure of the chaos world is like this, layer upon layer, shackle upon shackle. His companion's expression was also a little startled, and his words were filled with indescribable shock. Before this, they were all human beings. Although they were lonely, they were absolutely free. The development of their own world and their own development were carried out completely according to their own will and their own worldview. It could be said that apart from the loneliness of not being able to contact their own kind, everything else was perfect, but now he heard the heavenly Tao incarnation say that everything he felt was just an illusion. He wasn't as free as he thought he was. There were still endless shackles and shackles on his body. All his thoughts and all the changes of his world were actually affected by some factor that he couldn't sense. So all of this is actually fake? If you want to obtain freedom and truth, the only way is to destroy the shackles of the world? Another world founder asked with a complicated expression. At this moment, it was unknown how many world founders were paying attention to this place. The moment the world founder asked that question, the atmosphere in the entire transportation network layer instantly changed. An indescribable hostility and alertness began to spread between the worlds. There was even an indescribable resentment and hostility that constantly gathered towards the worlds that had gone through at least one tribulation. Among them, the resentment and hostility gathered by Luo Fan's world of laws was the best in the entire transportation network layer. After all, in the transportation network layer, the world of laws stood at the pinnacle, the source of all the shackles of the world. Chapter 2782. The incarnation's words were like a bucket of cold water poured over their heads, causing the restless hearts of the world founders to freeze. The world founders might have different personalities, but none of them were truly stupid. Truly stupid existences would never become world founders, nor would they have existed in the simulated state of chaos for such a long time. To them, there were some things that they could not figure out as long as they did not think about it. If they truly thought about it calmly, it would not be a real problem for them to figure out how much help destroying the world above them would be to their world. Previously, because they were unhappy, they did not think too much before proposing the solution of destroying the upper world. However, at this moment, with the heavenly axioms incarnation's words, the facts that they had forcibly ignored before began to surface in their minds. Are we really going to have nothing to worry about after destroying the world above us? The world founders asked themselves. Very soon, the answer appeared in their hearts. How is this possible? The structure of the world and the chaos has not changed. Even if the previous world is destroyed, under the rules of the structure of the world, the state of chaos will only shift a new world to make up for the position of that world. The shackles and shackles of our world will not change much. What should exist will still exist, and what should be powerful will still be powerful. The founders thought to themselves, and their faces became increasingly bitter. At that moment, the entire transportation network became heavy. Of course, there was also an inexplicable sense of relaxation amidst the heaviness. The relaxation amidst the heaviness was naturally because all the worlds here were suffering from the same affliction. No matter where they were essentially no different from other worlds. This situation naturally made the world founders feel heavy. But at the same time, it was precisely because there was no difference that the worlds that stood above other worlds no longer had to worry about being targeted by other worlds. They would be schemed against by other worlds. That was naturally enough for them to feel relaxed. Do we have no choice but to accept it? One of the world founders said with a bitter smile. Even my master can only accept this structure. Do you think you're better than my master? The incarnation said to the world founders in disdain. Hearing this, the hearts of the world founders instantly calmed down. The world's founders, who were originally vigilant against Luo Fan and even vaguely hostile towards him, suddenly felt that their hatred and vigilance no longer had a foothold. If it was really as the heavenly Tao incarnation had said, then all the abnormalities, influences, and schemes that they had sensed earlier could be explained. All of this seemed to be due to the chaotic structure of the world. It was an influence that even Luo Fan could not reverse or change. For the sake of being influenced by Luo Fan's will, they hated Luo Fan and guarded against Luo Fan. They all felt that it was a bit too much. As for why he was certain that these shackles and influences did not come from Luo Fan's will, that was naturally because the shackles and influence that their world exerted on other worlds were not something that they wanted to. Of course, although their vigilance and hatred had disappeared, it was clearly impossible for them to apologize to Luo Fan. At this moment, the world founders gradually dispersed and returned to their own worlds to sort out the changes that the transportation network layer had on their worlds. The entire transportation network layer gradually entered a relatively calm state. Of course, because the structure was revealed without any concealment, the many worlds in the transportation network layer were gradually divided into layers. The connection between the worlds of the same layer became closer, while the connection between the worlds of different layers became less and less. This was a matter of course. Although they knew that this structure was not the will of any world, and it was not the will of any world that wanted to shackle and lock other worlds with shackles, it was a fact. However, the shackles of the heaven and earth above the heaven and earth below the heaven and earth were real. How big of a heart did the world founders have to be to not care about these shackles and shackles? How big of a heart did they have to be able to withstand these shackles and interact with the world above the world without any ill feelings? Therefore, it was extremely normal for the communication between the worlds of different layers to decrease. At the same time, to the many creators of the world, the same level of heaven and earth became much more meaningful than before. At the very least, they were in the same situation and could empathize with each other. Sympathizing with each other in the same boat would allow them to resonate with each other more, and the more resonance they would have, the more connections they would have with each other. As time went on, they would naturally become closer to each other. Just like this, after hundreds of years in the transportation network layer, the many worlds began to be divided into 4 layers, and they became distinct from each other. Even without the layers of roads separating them, just the distance between them was enough to distinguish them. Among them, the world of laws, which was at the peak of the entire transportation network layer, was obviously an existence that many worlds stayed away from. After all, in the transportation network layer, there was no world that was on the same level as the world of laws, and there was no world that empathized with it. All the heavens and earth rejected the thoughts of the heavens and earth of laws, and all of them kept a respectful distance from it. Because the transportation network layer had been accepted by the simulated chaos state and had become a kind of natural landscape that simulated chaos state. The flow of time in the transportation network layer was naturally no longer affected by the flow of time of the world of laws like before. Now, the flow of time in the transportation network layer had been fixed at the moment when it passed the tribulation. Compared to the flow of time in the world of laws, this flow of time was actually several times slower. A few hundred years in the transportation network layer was already thousands of years in the laws of the world. During this period of time, Luo Fan did not place his attention on the world of laws. Instead, he placed his attention on the transportation network layer. He carefully sensed the many changes in the transportation network layer after passing the layer tribulation and experienced the various subtle principles that belong to the transportation network layer. Over the years, there would be a resonance between the world and the transportation network layer at every moment, and it would actively connect to the transportation network layer and become a node of the transportation network layer. The entire transportation network layer was like a rapidly growing creature, growing stronger with every passing moment, becoming more perfect with every passing moment, and becoming more complex with every passing moment. And above the transportation network layer, the tribulation layer that still enveloped the entire transportation network layer seemed to have begun to take action after years of preparation. One tribulation passage after another was constantly born from the tribulation layer, extending towards the many worlds in the transportation network layer and plunging into the world one by one. This was unavoidable. Compared to the transportation network layer, hundreds of years was only a very short period of time. The time of the transportation network layer was obviously the same as the time of the tribulation layer. Therefore, if the tribulation of the transportation network layer itself was to be considered hundreds of years were obviously not enough for it to brew again. In other words, if the structure of the transportation network layer, the number of heavens and earths, and the individuals were the same as when the heavenly tribulation had just passed, it would be impossible for a new heavenly tribulation to brew after just a few hundred years, and the heavenly tribulation path wouldn't take root in the transportation network layer. However, such an if obviously didn't happen. Even if one didn't look at the number of worlds that had joined the transportation network layer in the past hundreds of years, just the number of worlds that had joined the transportation network layer after the layer tribulation was more than 10 times that of the original number of worlds in the transportation network layer. None of these worlds had passed the tribulation together with the transportation network layer. For these worlds, the previous tribulation had nothing to do with them at all. They wouldn't gain immunity to the tribulation just because they had just passed the tribulation. They would only attract the tribulation layer at a certain time according to the development trend of their own world and finally guide the power of the tribulation to their own world. Now, the tribulation passages that extended from the tribulation layer were clearly the tribulation passages that targeted these worlds. These tribulation passages had the power of the tribulation constantly pouring into those worlds, constantly changing them in some kind of indescribable way, causing those worlds to start brewing the signs of the great tribulation of the world. This is the sign of another tribulation. Looking at all this, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inwardly. This kind of change couldn't be more natural. The transportation network layer became a chaotic layer that the simulated chaotic state acknowledged, and it became a kind of natural landscape that simulated chaotic state. Under such circumstances, the transportation network layer couldn't stop other worlds from actively connecting to it. And when those worlds actively connected to it, the great tribulation of the world would also pour into the transportation network layer once again. In the transportation network layer, the great tribulation of the world was the basic unit of the tribulation. The brewing of the great tribulation of the world meant that the tribulation of the world was brewing again. When the number of heavens and earths connected to the transportation network layer reached a certain amount, or when the number of heavens and earths in the transportation network layer reached a certain amount and was enough to trigger another layer tribulation, the layer tribulation would descend on the transportation network layer once again. Once again, the transportation network layer that was recognized by the simulated chaos state would be tested once again. This process would be repeated again and again until the worlds connected to the transportation network layer were all without tribulations and had survived the 9 great tribulations of heaven and earth. As long as one of the worlds had not gone through the 9 great tribulations of the world, this cycle couldn't be stopped. Perhaps the tribulation of the world won't just happen 9 times, but countless times. Understanding this essence, Luo Fan couldn't help but sigh inwardly. At this moment, he was no longer worried that he would have nothing to do after becoming a true divine and truly stepping into the chaotic state. Just the number of tribulations corresponding to this tribulation would probably be enough to keep him busy for eternity and struggle for eternity. After all, the simulated chaotic state was a kind of simulation of the real chaotic state. Since it was a simulation of the real chaos state, everything in the simulated chaos state would naturally be able to find its corresponding existence in the real chaos state. Of course, the reverse wasn't necessarily true. In other words, everything in the simulated chaos state could find its corresponding existence in the real chaos state, but not everything in the real chaos state could find its corresponding existence in the simulated chaos state. This layer tribulation was obviously a type of existence that evolved from the simulated chaos state. In the real chaos state, there would definitely be a corresponding existence in the real chaos state. Therefore, the almost endless nature of this tribulation must also exist in the true state of chaos. Any true sage, even if he had cultivated his own world into a great heaven and earth without tribulations and immeasurable, as long as there was a chaotic layer in the state of chaos that he participated in, he would not be able to avoid this almost endless tribulation. Even if this kind of tribulation might not have an intrinsic impact on the world itself and wouldn't really cause irreparable harm to the world, a tribulation was still a tribulation. As long as there was a tribulation, it meant that there was no peace, and it meant that one would not be at ease. After making wild speculations about the cultivation process of the true divine stage, which he didn't know if he could become a true divine in the future, Luo Fan suppressed all these thoughts in the depths of his heart. Compared to his current situation, the true divine stage was really too far away. Thinking about it now was just a groundless worry. Chapter 2783. Although this simulated primal chaos state contained endless mysteries and principles, no matter what, it was still Luo Fan's seventh great tribulation at its root. It was impossible for such an existence to stay here forever to experience the principles and mysteries that belong to the state of chaos. It wasn't a problem for him to experience and comprehend for a period of time, but he couldn't stay here forever. It was impossible for him to completely comprehend the simulated state of chaos and completely grasp everything before leaving. This was the simulated state of chaos. Even if it was just some kind of simulation of the state of chaos, it definitely contained endless principles and mysteries. Even if Luo Fan were to advance a few more realms, he might not be able to completely comprehend all of this, let alone the current him. Therefore, it could be said that this pursuit of perfection and thoroughness could also be regarded as a manifestation of this great tribulation. Tribulations weren't just like what mortals thought, such as thunder, lightning, fire, water, earth, wood, metal, poison, and so on and so forth. Tribulations had more diverse forms of expression. Direct attacks could be said to be the most basic of the basics. Truly powerful tribulations were generally invisible and unperceivable. Just like this simulated state of chaos, when Luo Fan first fell here, the rejection of the world and the various destructive powers that were born from it were obviously the most basic changes. The various inexplicable dangers that followed were the true manifestations of the profound tribulations. As for the previous ones, Luo Fan had either easily or safely resolved them. But now, the manifestations of the tribulations he encountered had become more subtle and difficult to sense. Among them, the attraction of the simulated state of chaos was obviously one of the manifestations of the power of the tribulations. This attraction could keep him in the simulated state of chaos. If he had the thought of completely comprehending the simulated state of chaos before leaving, there would be equivalent to him being shackled in the simulated state of chaos for a long time. What was the simulated state of chaos? That was a derivative of his seventh great calamity. If he was shackled here, wouldn't he be shackled here for a long time in the seventh tribulation? As time went on, anything could happen. There was no exception in this simulated state of chaos. The longer he stayed here, the more likely it was that he would encounter danger. Who knew when, due to some accident or necessity, he might encounter a crisis that he could not resist and end up losing his life in this simulated chaotic state. There were countless worlds in this simulated primal chaos state, among which there were countless worlds that had survived the great tribulation of heaven and earth compared to the world of laws. Among them, the number of world founders that could truly threaten Luo Fan was definitely not small. The higher Luo Fan explored, the more likely it was that he would encounter such existences. Naturally, it was more likely that they would encounter danger. At this time, Luo Fan was already aware of such a crisis. It was precisely because of this that Luo Fan made the decision to break through the shackles of the simulated primal chaos state and escape from it when the situation seemed to be going well. After making up his mind, he naturally began to act. However, it was clear that even if he made the decision, it would still be extremely difficult to achieve that result. This simulated chaotic state was simply too mysterious and subtle. If he wanted to explore it, there were naturally countless directions and possibilities. However, if he wanted to break through, this mystery and subtlety would be a great obstacle. At this moment, although Luo Fan had made up his mind was blank. For a moment, he didn't know which direction to work towards and how to break through this simulated chaotic state. If he was in some other place or some other limited existence, he would naturally have to reach the point that such an existence couldn't shackle or suppress in order to break through the restrictions. However, for this simulated chaotic state, what should he do if he wanted to use this method to break through? First, he would have to pass through the 9 great tribulations of the simulated chaotic state. Next, he would have to see through the boundaries of the simulated chaotic state during this process. Finally, he would be able to break through this boundary with the help of the supreme power that he would gain. Obviously, this method could be used for other existences. However, it was almost impossible to achieve such an effect with the simulated chaos in front of him. After all, the great tribulations of the simulated chaotic state were caused by the tribulation levels. And when would the great tribulation of heaven and earth descend? This depended entirely on the will of the tribulation level, or rather, the will of the simulated chaotic state itself. Perhaps, in the next moment, the remaining 6 great tribulations would descend at the same time. Or perhaps, there wouldn't be a 4th tribulation even after billions of years. This kind of uncertainty was clearly entrusting one's fate to the existence that one wanted to deal with. It could be said that it was completely dependent on whether one could survive the tribulation or not. How could Luo Fan be willing to do such a thing? Therefore, he obviously wouldn't choose this method. After a while, Luo Fan gradually turned his gaze to the tribulation level above the transportation network level. An inexplicable existence began to brew in his body, as if there was some kind of obstacle blocking the brewing thing, preventing it from rushing out. All sorts of strange, shattering sounds were constantly coming from his body. At this moment, although Luo Fan hadn't completely integrated with the world of laws, he didn't completely treat the world of laws as if it were his own body. However, the shattering sounds still caused the world of laws to undergo a huge change. The nomological laws, time, space, and even the great Tao in the dark all stirred violently at this moment, as if some kind of storm was brewing. For a moment, the heavenly Tao in the world of laws suddenly felt an indescribable sense of crisis. It automatically condensed in front of Luo Fan and revealed its form in an ever-changing figure. "Master, are you going to destroy me?" the heavenly Tao asked. Luo Fan looked at the heavenly Tao with an inexplicable glint flashing in his eyes. The heavenly Tao's behavior was already beyond his expectations. In his expectations, the heavenly Tao wouldn't show such a strong desire to survive. It seems that the influence appears unknowingly. I didn't expect to be corroded to this extent unknowingly. He sighed and lifted his head to look at the tribulation level. He didn't answer the heavenly Tao's question at all. To him, this wasn't a question he needed to answer at all. The heavenly Tao was merely his creation. It could be said that it was created for the convenience of managing the world. It was just an artificial consciousness attached to the world. Such a consciousness could be said to be just his prosthetic limb. Did he need to explain to it what he was going to do to it? Could he understand what he was thinking? At this moment, what he was most concerned about was the source of the changes in the heavenly Tao. After he established the world of laws, all the changes in the world of laws could be said to be under his absolute control. Except for one thing, which was the various powers that were injected into the world of laws when the tribulation level gave out rewards. Although the various powers and changes to the world were carried out according to his will, according to his worldview, according to his plans for the world, and his thoughts about the world, it was all carried out in accordance with his will. However, this couldn't change the fact that it was an external power. Since it was an external power, the changes it made to the world of laws must have too many points that could be used by external existences. Obviously, the changes in the heavenly Tao were a manifestation of the results being used. Perhaps there were other possibilities, or it might even be a certain characteristic of the state of chaos. But obviously, the most likely source of the problem was the tribulation level. And it was only in the tribulation level that he had a chance to solve it. The heavenly Tao didn't get an answer, and its body gradually changed. Its desire to survive grew stronger and stronger, and it began to automatically guide the power of the world of laws towards its location and into the heavenly Tao. compared to the other worlds in the transportation network level, the heavenly Tao was billions of times stronger. If compared to the heavenly Tao, the other worlds were at most equivalent to one of the parallel worlds of the heavenly Tao. And in a place like the world of laws, there were billions and trillions of such parallel universes. Now, because of Luo Fan's decision, the countless parallel worlds had transformed into another form and descended to the place where the main body of the world was. Therefore, they were also under the control of the heavenly Tao, like the main body of the world, and could be used by the heavenly Tao. At this time, the heavenly Tao had absorbed the power of the countless parallel universes and gathered it at its location in order to welcome Luo Fan's possible appearance and plan against it. The authority that the heavenly Tao had in the heavenly Tao was unimaginably strong. If it was in other worlds, this kind of authority would be enough to suppress the authority of the creator of the world to the point that he couldn't even breathe. However, in this heavenly Tao, this kind of authority couldn't even shake Luo Fan's authority. No matter how much power it gathered or how much turbulence it caused, it couldn't really shake Luo Fan in the slightest. In fact, it couldn't even cause any damage to the heavenly Tao. The thing that was brewing inside Luo Fan's body was constantly breaking through something. The turbulence in the world also became more and more intense because of this. Finally, at a certain moment, a thunderous sound rang out from Luo Fan's body. The entire heavenly Tao seemed to be suddenly fixed in place at this moment. All the turbulence stopped as if it was being pressed down by an invisible hand. Immediately afterward, a ray of light that seemed to be alive erupted from Luo Fan's body, brazenly breaking through all obstacles and barriers and descending into the heavenly Tao. That was the light of heaven and earth. It was the light of heaven and earth that Luo Fan hadn't sensed ever since he entered the simulated state of chaos. Even he had almost forgotten about it. After the light of heaven and earth appeared, endless roots began to be released from his body. Like a huge network, they directly spread towards the entire heavenly Tao, including the endless parallel worlds of this heavenly Tao. In the blink of an eye, it had completely connected all the parallel worlds and everything in this heavenly Tao. At this moment, the heavenly Tao's body had already become stagnant. No matter how strong it was, no matter how much power it had, it couldn't change the fact that it had become stagnant. It was unknown how many strange roots appeared out of thin air inside the heavenly Tao's body. Occasionally, some would rush out from the surface of his body before quickly turning around and drilling back into his body from another location. Following that, the heavenly Tao's body gradually disintegrated. Not long after, it completely disappeared from the heavenly Tao's world without even uttering a single word. At the same time, the incarnations of the countless world founders that existed in the heavenly Tao's world also felt some kind of incredible power erupting from their bodies. In an instant, their wills became blurry and gradually disappeared completely. All these changes happened in an instant. In the blink of an eye, everything was over. The light of heaven and earth had already completely controlled everything in the heavenly Tao. It even felt like it had completely devoured the heavenly Tao. At this time, Luo Fan exhaled a long breath, only to feel that his mind had become clear. The inexplicable shock that originally clouded his heart had completely disappeared without a trace. Looking at the tribulation layer above the transportation network layer, it was no longer as faint as before. He had clearly grasped the existence of the tribulation layer and all the tribulation channels that extended out from it and penetrated into the transportation network layer.